Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, and welcome to the latest episode of the Hard Compound Live. For those of you who don't know, my name is Rich and I run and operate the Hard Compound. We are a one-stop shop for all things motorsport across Facebook, Twitter, YouTube and Instagram. So do give us a follow on those. Just search for the Hard Compound and make sure you don't miss out on any of the good motorsport stuff. We put out about 3 or 4 posts a day on those platforms. Excuse me. And we cover everything from F1 to IndyCar, touring cars, to rallying, bikes to NASCAR and everything in between. These are done in the form of any race reviews, any race previews, any breaking news, any throwbacks, any car livery reveals like one-off ones from Monaco, as an example, and everything else in. But so we also do live video interviews. As you might have noticed, these are all broadcast on our Facebook, our Twitter, and our YouTube channels, and they're also recorded immediately for viewing afterwards, so you can watch them back if you aren't able to tune in live. We've had many guests from across the motorsport spectrum, whether it be from the past or the present, and some rising stars as well. From the British Touring Car Championship, from Formula One, from IndyCar, from the world of sports cars, the world of rallying, bikes, everything else. Not going to name them all, but just to give you an idea, we've had the likes of just last week, we spoke with Carl Jones from the British Touring Car Championship. We've also spoken with the likes of Jason Plato, Frank Sittner, Graham Good, Matt Neal, Ivan Muller, Steve Soper, Gabriele Tarquini, Andy Prio, etc., etc. We've also had the likes of Mr. Stefan Johansson. We've spoken to Emanuele Pirro, to Mika Salo, to Brian Herter, to Catherine Legg, Alonso Jr., Ari Lyondike, Danny Sullivan, many others. But we've also spoken with the likes of Mr. Mario Andretti and with Mr. Jackie Ickx, 2 legends of motorsport, which leads us very nicely onto today's guest. As I said, a legend of motorsport. He's raced in Formula One. He's raced at Le Mans. He's won races for some of the biggest teams in the world. So without any further ado, we're going to bring him in right now. Please join me in extending a very warm welcome to the legend, Mr. John Watson.
Afternoon, Richard, and thank you for calling me a legend, because I seem to be left out of the legends list or roll of honor by some of our more eminent magazines, publications, journalists. So it's a pleasure. Thank you.
Well, it's a staggering omission, because certainly in my mind you're up there with the greats of certainly of at least 2 eras. But thank you so much for coming on and having a chat. I really appreciate it, and it's obviously great to speak with you on a personal level. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Look forward to it.
Right, well, we've got plenty to cover. I mean, obviously, we're all fairly familiar with your career, and whether it be on track and off track. I've just seen a few comments already about people who remember you on the British Touring Car Championship commentary and things like that, which we'll come to. Just want to say a very quick hello to the folks who are already putting things in the comments. Hello to Oliver and to Paul and a few people tuning in on YouTube and many others. Thank you so much. If you have any questions or comments, do put them in the comment section, and we'll do our very best to work them into this chat we're going to have this afternoon. So I guess time to get cracking. I guess it's best to start right at the start. I mean, where did your interest come from, John, in the world of motorsport?
I suppose you have to start really in the early 50s. And my father, he had started a business in the motor business in Belfast. And at that time, people in the motor business had access to cars, because cars were scarce following the Second World War, but also race cars, because a lot of race cars had been stored and they were coming out of hibernation. So many of them ended up in Northern Ireland, where I was born. So my father then would race purely as a hobby at a weekend, and I would visit that event with my family, and so went there as a child and got absorbed into it, and eventually everything then spawned out of that.
Fantastic. So you kind of almost brought up around cars and racing and things like that. When was it that you first went to watch a motorsport event, or when did you first get involved in the actual racing side? I mean, I heard a lovely story from a local circuit to you back in Belfast, and with some great names on track.
Well, my racing started in 1964, a little Aston Healey Sprite, which had been my daily drive. So that car was then taken off the road, and a Formula Junior BMC A series engine fitted, and a couple of changes to the suspension, and a set of Dunlop SP3 tires, and that was my race car. So I started and competed in club events really throughout Ireland, both north and south, and graduated into a Crosley sports racing car in 65 and retained the car for 66. 67, then we bought a Brabham, which we raced in a championship called the Irish Formula 2 Championship, which was essentially a crossover between, let's say, Formula Junior and at that time what was Formula 2. But we ran with a Ford twin cam motor, not the FVA engine that was then the standard Formula 2 engine. And it was very competitive. It was good racing, lots of very competitive competitors. And again, raced throughout the north and south, Phoenix Park, Kirkeston, Bishop's Court, Mondello Park, which then came on stream in the late 60s. I did race at Dunboyne, but not in a single-seater. By the time Dunboyne got to, I think, 1967, when I started single-seaters, the event that was held on that wonderful road circuit was then it became the sole territory, I think, of touring cars or saloon cars. I think single-seaters and the rest were deemed to be probably too quick for the track, and there had tragically been a number of serious and fatal accidents, so they restricted the entry more or less then just to touring cars.
Right, just from a safety aspect, I guess. I mean, obviously with single-seaters and we know the dangers of like racing on roads or things like that, and certainly at speed. So yeah, it's probably best to get a roof over people's heads when they're driving. You said that you were like competitive in the in those series out there on the Emerald Isle. When did it sort of become to move over to the mainland or to the UK mainland to, I guess, get some progression? When did you start to think this is something that I can really get my teeth into?
Well, I think midway through the 60s, it was quite normal for fellow competitors from Ireland to go over to England or maybe sometimes to Scotland. Likewise, English, Scottish, Welsh competitors would come over to Ireland. So I would go over maybe at holiday weekends, Easter time, or events at that, holiday periods like that. Race Oulton Park, Mallory Park, a place called Rufford, which is up in North Yorkshire, Ingleston, and then, of course, whatever I was doing in Ireland. And that then gave me an introduction to racing against people I hadn't competed against before, and people that were probably much better known, because competing in England was always going to be at a higher level, we thought. But actually, the levels that we were racing at in Ireland amongst fellow competitors was actually quite high. But to go and race on the better known circuits in the mainland was the beginning of a step forward. But the real key for me came in 1969 when fellow competitor and friend Jerry Kinane acquired the two remaining Lotus 48s from Lotus. And these cars were entered by Jerry under the team banner of Team Ireland in the Easter Thruxton Formula 2 event. So that was the first time I'd competed in what I would describe as a high-level international race meeting. And never sat in the car, never drove the car until we got to Thruxton, never driven a Formula 2 car till we got to Thruxton, never driven a car with the aerodynamics that the car had. I think the front the rear we had quite a tall wing. It wasn't the conventional wing that would have become the norm in Formula 2. So it all was a big first, because Thruxton is a very quick circuit. And in practice, we had a few issues with misfires, but in the main event, suddenly it all began to click, and I found myself running quickly. catching and overtaking drivers who I'd only ever read about, and I thought, well, they are heroes, and why am I overtaking them? And eventually got up to, I think, to 5th position. Then later in the race, ran off the track, and that was the end of the race. And sadly, it did a bit of damage to the car, but I think it put down a marker that this weirdo guy with a beard and a trilby hat standing in the paddock actually was not bad at all.
Yeah, maybe you caught the eye of some people, through that, and obviously, as you said, especially given that you'd not even driven the car before arriving at Thruxton, which is amazing. And I guess that obviously gave you a bit of maybe like a shot in the arm, I guess, just as a bit of confidence to say, look, I can do this, I can compete, I can get into a car and like race well. What was your kind of next step thereafter?
Well, I think it did two things. It gave me the realization that I had the ability to compete at that level against drivers who who were established drivers both in Formula 2 and in other formulas. And I think it made my family, particularly my mother and father, realize that finally Pandora's box had been opened and the genie wasn't going to go back into it again. So the concept of me following my father in the motor business was going to be a less appealing or attractive profession or proposition. And what my parents and my family did was they thought, well, the best way maybe to address this is to support their son, me, and give him the opportunity to go out and have a season or whatever in Formula 2 and take it from wherever it takes us to. So in 1970, I then started a season of the European Formula 2 Championship with a privately entered Brabham BT30, which was a pure family event. There was no commercial sponsorship. In Ireland, commercial sponsorship was rarer than hen's teeth. So it was a great little car. And the first race in that car, again, I hadn't driven it until I got to Thruxton in 1970. And in my heat, the front row of the grid was Jochen Rindt, Jackie Higgs, and me.
Wow.
So I think a lot of people, I think that was the reaction a lot of people had in the paddock. Wow, this guy, a bog standard BT30, rocks up and puts in the front row of the grid with these two megas, two Grand Prix winners.
Did you expect to be like rubbing shoulders on the grid with those kinds of guys so quickly? Because it must have, obviously it was a shock to other people, perhaps more than likely. Was it a surprise to you?
I think the surprise was that when you get down to the short hairs, we're all human beings, and it's a question of who's got what level of ability. And what it I think confirmed again was I had quite a lot of natural ability. I was very naive in other areas. And by the next race, I think, was Hockenheim. And I'd never driven on a high-speed slipstream circuit like Hockenheim. And I didn't understand what you had to do at Hockenheim to get a grid position. And I didn't qualify because I had never been involved in high-speed slipstreaming. We didn't have that in Ireland. And I never had experience of it racing in England. So that took me out of my comfort zone. So I was very quickly brought back down to earth with the reality that motor racing in Europe, as opposed to racing in Great Britain, different circuits, different style of driving, and drivers in Formula 2 who at Thruxton I hadn't even seen in my mirrors had qualified ahead of me because they had raced at Hockenheim. They understood what slipstreaming was about, and they understood how to put it into effect.
And certainly on the circuit, like the old Hockenheim circuit, that's probably the certainly epitome of a slipstream circuit, isn't it? What, just very quickly, what was that circuit like to drive? Because obviously we've got perhaps a generation now of people who only know the shorter Hockenheim version, not the huge loop. At my time, there was a couple of chicanes had been put in.
Yeah.
But what was that original layout like to drive? It must have been incredible.
Well, I think in today's terms, you'd say it was nuts.
Yeah.
At the time, it was a traditional circuit. It was a very much a stadium based circuit with this long loop that went out into the forest, literally into the forest. And at the far end, I think they called it the Ust curve. And then you had a return leg of the straight, which took you into the stadium part of the racetrack. And once you left the stadium on that long leg out to Ust curve, it was probably a mile and a bit long, I don't know. And the key in any race car at that time, be it a Formula One car, Formula Two, any race car, it was a slipstream circuit. And you had to understand and use the slipstream. And maybe you wanted to have a slipstream on the out straight, a slipstream on the return straight. So you're always looking ideally for people to pick up the aerodynamic slipstream from, to give you that slingshot to get past and pick up extra speed, and then do the same on the return leg into the stadium. Once in the stadium, that was more or less like any regular racetrack. But the time on the circuit was not made up in the stadium, which is the mistake I made. I thought I was going to be quick enough in the stadium to compensate for what I was losing on the two straights. That was a mistake.
Because I guess the stadium section was what, the fifth or a quarter of the lap, perhaps, something like that.
It was about maybe a quarter to a third, roughly.
Yeah.
But it was very much second, third gear corners. I mean, it was a good part of the circuit, but it didn't compensate for those two extremely long straights where, I mean, you didn't have to do anything on the straight, but just you had to pick up somebody else's slipstream or position yourself to pick up somebody's slipstream.
Yeah, just try and get in some clean air, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. And yeah, fantastic old circuit. I saw somewhere someone said that it'd be great if it could be resurrected in its old form for F1. I thought, well, I don't think it would work today, would it, with the DRS and all that? It would just be one big DRS button, wouldn't it?
I think it would be. I mean, unfortunately, the circuits of this generation, the circuits I raced on, very, very few of them in the configuration that they were in at that time could actually be adapted or would be suitable for Formula One or contemporary motor racing. And if you imagine what a Formula One car can achieve on the relatively short straights that we have now, I mean, I think the longest straight is either Baku or, it's not Spa. There's one or two who've got long straights. So they're getting to 212, 15 maybe or so miles per hour. At Hockenheim, if they'd kept those long straights, no chicanes, they would be up around the 225, 230 miles an hour.
Yeah.
And I mean,
it's incredible.
Formula One isn't about that kind of racing today. And circuits are designed to provide entertainment. Don't forget about the trackside advertising. One of the core issues about motor racing today is you've got to have the trackside advertising because that's where revenue streams come from.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, it's not just about the racing. There's so much more to it now. And
there's a lot more to it than just simply, let's say, revert back to 1970 and send the cars and have a look and see. Actually, funny enough, I bet you a penny to a pound if you were able to do that. And sadly, at Hockenheim, you can't because the loop on the circuit now is it's all gone back to grass, I believe.
Yeah, it's all.
But I think there probably are a number of contemporary drivers that would relish that opportunity.
Oh, I'll bet there are, absolutely. We'll kind of move it forward in a moment. Just on the subject of tracks, you've got a lot of questions coming into the comment section. But while we're on the subject, we've got Forrest Howie. Hello, Forrest. He said, "What does Mr. Watson think of the of the Tilke tracks? Designed by Mr. Tilke, because there's a lot of criticism I've seen across the world of social media of them. They're become known as Tilke-dromes, and they're sort of almost described as being soulless, almost. But just wondering what your thoughts are on these newer circuits."
I think the fundamental circuit layout I don't have a lot of problem with, but one of the areas where modern racetracks, I feel they take away what I would call, in some respects, the pride when you would approach a corner, let's say in 1970, where you didn't have these wide open spaces, you didn't have these big wide flat runoff areas, you didn't have these fairly flat curbing. So track abuse was something that was probably heavily punished. And of course, on a lot of the circuits, I mean, some of the circuits, for example, in the Middle East, where there's no natural sort of habitat around the racetrack.
Yeah.
So it looks a bit soulless and a bit bare, so characterless possibly. But I think the actual circuit layouts are challenging for the cars of today. And make no mistake, the present cars are very quick and they've got extremely high cornering speeds. The braking zones are very short. So the cars on the circuits are as challenging today as my cars in my era would have been. But the difference I feel, and I think it's wrong to criticize Tilke for the circuit layouts. If you had the kind of proximity of what would have been around the circuits I raced on today's circuit, you'd have totally different visual appreciation. And the circuit, you say, wow, that's a fantastic circuit. And if you think of some of the corners, some of those quick corners in some of the circuits, and you had grass up to the edge of the racetrack and maybe not far behind it, a forest of trees. Well, this weekend you got Monte Carlo. Monte Carlo is basically unchanged.
Yeah.
The challenge is still the same as it was in my generation and those before me. And I think, funny enough, all these drivers who run and abuse track limits get penalized, get times disallowed. If they drove like that at Monaco, they wouldn't make a lap. So the adjustment is there.
Yeah.
And look, it would be lovely in some circuits to plant something very close to the edge of the circuit, do away with these very flat runoffs. Remember also, some of the circuits that are Formula One circuits are used for MotoGP, Silverstone MotoGP. So you have to have consideration for MotoGP competitors or for motorcyclists in the event that if they have a tumble or high side or whatever, that when they land, they're not landing on aggressive curbing. I mean, for example, one great MotoGP or 500cc motorcycle world champion, Wayne Rainey, suffered a back break, and he's been in a wheelchair ever since. Now, albeit he went to the Festival of Speed last year at Goodwood, and Yamaha, amongst others, managed to get him on a bike with all the controls operated by his. I mean, that was a moment in history. I'm getting goosebumps thinking about it.
He was with, was it Mick Doohan and the other guys, wasn't he? And Kevin Swanson. It was fantastic, wasn't it?
Unbelievable. I mean, one of the most special moments of that weekend was to see Wayne Rainey ride, and he didn't spare it. I mean, it was as if he had never been off a bike.
Yeah.
So those are a lot of things that have been considered. So I mean, just to criticize Tilke circuits, I think the core layouts, okay, they're different to some of the circuits I raced on, but the basic circuit layout, I don't have a big criticism of. The bigger problem is, I think, that technology and current Formula One car performance is emasculating a lot of circuits. The pace of evolution and development of modern Formula One cars, aerodynamics in particular, and then that leads into braking and other elements, has to some degree emasculated circuit layouts.
For sure.
I mean, look, if you went back to the type of tire that in 1974 I would have raced on, and that time it was a Firestone, and Firestone and Goodyear were the two tire suppliers. The rubber would have been the equivalent of concrete and clay by today's standards. Wow. I mean, another example in WEC, the first round, I think this year was at the Spa 1,000 kilometers. Ambient temperatures were low. They had at that point removed tire warmers.
Yes.
And I think coming out of the pit lane down into Eau Rouge, one of the LMP Ferraris spun up a rear wheel, turned sharp left, went into the barriers, and that's what we raced on. We raced on tires that we didn't have tire warmers in those days. We had different sized front to rear tires, so everything was quite different. But we're not going to go back. We're not going to turn the clock back. We are where we are with technology, and it's continually, in spite of budget caps and whatever, the teams are pushing every second of the day to find more efficiency, more whatever it is, aerodynamic efficiency, every level. And Monaco this weekend, no doubt, whether it'll be Red Bull, whether it'll be Ferrari, whether it'll be Mercedes, those are the three. Oh, sorry, even my hero, Fernando.
Yes.
Wouldn't I don't know anybody who wouldn't love to see Fernando win the Monaco Grand Prix in an Aston Martin. And I tell you who would love it even more are the Chinese investors in Aston Martin who put in another 200 million, whatever it was, into the company to see it move forward. So there's lots of things that are going on, and it's easy to look back, and I can reflect back and say, my generation was a great generation, and I still will maintain that, but for reasons which are not to do just with the technology of the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And great point about Fernando. And obviously, I think he's probably the best all-round driver of a generation. And he gets stick, of course he does. But I'd love to see him win the Monaco Grand Prix for Aston Martin, just for Aston, for him, and for the sport. But just to go back, you mentioned about Wayne Rainey, the accident that he suffered. It wasn't even a really bad one. He just sort of slid off and he just landed on the curb, and that's what did the damage, wasn't it? And it just. But I think you're right. In fact, that the circuits aren't bad. It's just the location of them, as you say. There's no sort of banking or trees or anything. Which, and someone has said that if you get the rights to run a race in the desert, for example, how on earth can you make it aesthetically pleasing? And I think you're right with the surroundings of the circuit.
Yeah, absolutely.
If I don't know, so like Eau Rouge and Radion were on the side of not a sand dune, but you know what I mean, a big bare hill, it wouldn't perhaps have the as much of an effect on the fans watching it as it does having a trees and a bank and a grandstand and everything there, because it's so closed in. So,
no, I think there are so many circuits that I raced on that I would love to see the current competitors have a go on, first of all, and then race on. I mean, we're going to a street track in this weekend, Monte Carlo. It's been there since 1929. It is a fabulous venue. It's not the best racetrack. I think the best street circuit I ever raced on was in Barcelona, Montjuïc Park.
Oh yeah,
absolutely the epitome of what I think a great street or road track should be. I would love to see the Spanish Grand Prix, instead of being on the circuit, the current circuit, return to Montjuïc Park.
It would be
absolutely blow the doors of everybody's imagination.
I mean, I've actually been there. Obviously not with the circuit, but I've been there thinking this is where they'd have been coming up here and around there, and I've sort of pictured it in my mind, and it's an incredible location. And obviously we're going to come to an event that happened at that.
Yes.
Sadly. But yeah, I'm with you on that. People don't tend to talk about Montjuïc much anymore, but it's incredible. It's just on that little, it's like a big lump of rock, isn't it?
It is,
of Barcelona. It's fabulous.
I mean, it's a place, if anybody goes to Barcelona and they've got any interest in motorsport, they should just take half a day and visit the place. And I don't know how much of the racetrack still actually is in position, but the section of the circuit where you started the climb up the hill back up to the plateau where the pits and the paddock and all that were based, it's a sequence of quick lefts and rights, and they got quicker as you went up the hill. And then you sort of came through a very quick right-hand corner onto that pit straight. Then you climbed up left and up left and up left. And then there's that quick dip where cars, there's a photograph of me in 1975 driving for John Surtees, where the four wheels are off the ground. Must be about a foot of air between the car and the ground. That's where that very severe accident happened in 1969, Graham Hill, but more so Jochen Rindt, when they had a rear wing failure. This is one of the big tall rear wings. And both cars had rear wing failures at that part of the racetrack. Tragically, in 75, there was the accident with Ross Tomlin. Again, that was a rear wing failure, because I believe, and I'll say this with caution, the cause of that was because the car, I think that was the hill that Graham Hill Embassy Racing, I believe that they were using carbon fiber wing mounts.
Right.
And that was an early iteration of carbon fiber. And the going back to what I mentioned when we were off camera, the use of that material is not a metal substitute. It's a material in its own right, and it needs to be treated in its own right. But anyway, there's a rear wing failure on Rolf at the quickest part of the circuit, at probably the most critical part of the circuit, where a car is just teetering on the very edge, and tragically 2 people lost their life.
Yeah, which was almost the that was pretty much the end of it, wasn't it?
That finished there have been events, I think, there subsequently, but certainly in terms of Formula One. But even before we got underway, we got to the circuit, and there was all of a sudden shock horror when a few people went and sat on a barrier, and they realized the barriers were basically, weren't even properly done up. So there was very little running until, I think, the Saturday. because there was virtually a driver strike. And I remember having meetings with the GPDA, will we race, won't we race? And the first driver actually to venture onto the racetrack was one of your former interviewees.
It was Jackie, wasn't it? Because he
Jackie
wasn't
Eakes, yeah.
part
So
of the
Jackie jumped into his Lotus and went out. And of course, once one driver had set the train in motion, then everybody else sort of bit by bit got into their cars and went on the track. But there was a lot of time was spent on the opening day to get the circuit and the barriers in particular to a condition that they ought to have been in the first place. But that took nothing away for me for that racetrack. I went there first in 1970 in Formula 2. That's when I fell in love with the place. I just thought, wow, this is a proper, and it's again this issue about precision when you're driving, because Monaco is not a high-speed circuit. Barcelona, in relative terms, was. And it was the degree of precision. How close can you get to a barrier without contact? How close can you exit a corner with a barrier on the outside without contact? And that's maybe what I feel is lacking in where we are today with not just Formula One, but contemporary motor racing, because of the nature of the corner, the sort of entry to a corner and the exit of a corner. They're virtually flat. There's too much option, too many opportunities to abuse track limits.
Yeah, there's almost takes away that bit of jeopardy if you do get it slightly wrong. And and what people seem to forget, or perhaps they're not thinking the right way about it, about Monaco and other street circuits. If you speak to every driver, they will always say, "Oh, Monaco's a fantastic challenge." It's because you've got to be for those reasons that you've just said.
Yeah.
But obviously, those looking in from the outside, perhaps it's a generational thing. I don't know. They're saying, "Oh, but it's not very exciting. There's no overtaking." And I think it's got to be it's got to be a sport for the drivers first, rather than all about the show. I mean, the show's important, but
yeah, but there's lots of elements in what you're saying. I mean, if you want to watch excitement at Monaco, watch around the swimming pool, because that is nuts. I mean, the speed current Formula One cars go through, exit the swimming pool complex. I mean, I remember when I did it, and that was back in the early 80s or 70s and 80s, and the circuit was different. There were different. The corners have been eased a lot in that part of the racetrack, but nevertheless, I mean, for example, in 1985, Senna in the Lotus, whatever that was, model 95, whatever it was.
95, yeah.
With Honda, no, that was Renault Power, maximum boost, qualifying wing. I mean, it literally, can a human being do what I've just witnessed him doing? And I've never seen a driver like Senna. I mean, I was present. I was standing by the entry to the swimming pool, and it was just, I get the shivers thinking about it.
Just staggering.
I mean, unbelievable that somebody had the ability to control their machine at the speed they were going through that part of the circuit. And again, in that time in 85, there was a much more aggressive turn left, turn right through the entry to the swimming pool complex. And then likewise, the exit was a lot more acute as well.
Because now there's a curb, but there's no barrier, is there?
They've taken so much of it has been, you might say, emasculated, maybe for reasons of safety, I don't know. But certainly the challenge is still a massive challenge, but it's a different challenge. And I think that the sort of the level of what I would call precision, when you had much more obvious areas where you could go so far, and that was it. It was either a solid wall or a solid barrier, one side or the other.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, I mean, to watch qualifying, and that's the area of the racetrack I think is just sensational to see a Formula One car perform through. That will be the high point for me. The rest of the circuit, in relative terms, the corners are not particularly high speed. Through the tunnel now, easy flat. I mean, you'll probably find somebody might be trying to not literally go around the outside of somebody, but they'll be looking to find a way before they get into the braking zone. And the braking zone now comes very quickly after you've exited the tunnel. So there's lots of changes to the circuit. Circuit is still a massive challenge for the competitors. The biggest problem, going back to this thing about technology and where we are with Formula, the current cars are real, I would call them the real porkers. Now, fortunately, a car is an inanimate object. So if you call it a porker, you're not saying something that is politically incorrect. No one's going to take you off radio or take you off television for calling a Formula One car a porker. You might laugh at that.
It's a car.
It's a car. Let's get rid. It's just a bit of carbon fiber and metal and whatever else. But they're large. And the consequence is they're long, they're wide, they're very quick, they've got huge aerodynamic components, they've got phenomenal braking. So again, this is this emasculation of racetracks.
Yeah.
The best part of Monaco will always be on qualifying Saturday afternoon. Rarely do you get what I would call a stellar race. But what you might have is, let's say, against all expectation, it rains, as it did in '83, just before the start of the race.
And as is the forecast for Sunday.
In '84, when it tipped down for the entire race. You had outstanding drives from Alain Prost, who won the race, but arguably maybe got the checkered flag one lap too early.
Yes. From
Senna in the Tolman. The man who actually could have won that race, and some people say should have won that race, was Stefan Bellof.
Stefan Bellof, yeah.
So sometimes to get a really cracking race, you better look at, please God, turn the taps on. But the image of Monaco is not about a wet race. It's about glorious
sunshine and yachts.
Formula 2 practice a few minutes ago. Glorious sunshine. The harbour glistens like a jewel. There are people down there, corporate guests, race fans. They're going to have the weekend of their lives. I wish I was there, but only if I was contributing to the race.
Yeah, sure. When we talk about rain, apparently it is meant to rain on Sunday, so who knows? We might get a bit of
that might be the arbiter that gives us a classic Grand Prix, because if it does rain, it probably might also dry up, and then you've got this situation of at which point does the crossover between a wet tire, wet track, drying track, dry tire, when does that come? And making that call is fundamental. So if it was, look, one way, God, I can't think how long ago, back in the summer in the 90s when I was working at Eurosport at the Belgian Grand Prix, Bernie Ecclestone used to take the television broadcast unit team members, whatever, out for supper, out to dinner. And one evening, being typical of me, and I sometimes like this sort of concept of lateral thinking. And Bernie Ecclestone is the master of lateral thinking. So Bernie, what are we going to do? Make the racing more exciting, more appealing, because it's becoming too predictable. I said, Bernie, here's an idea. You might want to think about it. And I'm thinking he's going to shoot me down in flames. I said, why do you not, mandate that every racetrack is going to have a sprinkler system?
Yeah.
Not to turn it on mid-race, but to turn it on half an hour before a race starts. Now, it might be in the middle of the desert in Abu Dhabi or Dubai, and it might dry up in the space of 3 or 4 laps. Or it might be maybe at Spa or Nürburgring or Hockenheim or a Northern European circuit, even at Silverstone, because you're trying to get rid of predictability.
Yeah.
And it has been spoken about. It's never been done. But if it was done, I know it's maybe introducing something maybe you might consider artificial, but it's artificial in a manner which might help get away from what we've been really witnessing over the last 2 decades, the level of domination from one manufacturer, Ferrari, then a little bit of McLaren, then Red Bull, then now Mercedes, and back to Red Bull. I think predictability is something which, to me, is spoiling Formula One.
Yeah.
So I don't want to say that. I don't want to spoil Red Bull's parade, because they've done a phenomenal job. But I think people that are watching at home, or people that have paid good money to go to any Grand Prix to sit, and they want to see, look, on the lid, what does it say on the lid? Motor racing. It doesn't say a parade of racing cars.
Yeah.
I want to see.
You want to see racing.
I want to see the people that are in those race cars. They're called racing drivers. Now, some of them are racers, and some of them are racing drivers. I like the racers. Those are the ones that actually know what racing is all about, can overtake, can make an overtake where maybe others wouldn't even dream about it. And that's what I would love to see. But I don't know how we're going to get there, because technology and the science and the tools that teams have now got are so sophisticated that they're always ahead of the curve.
Things. Yeah, I completely agree. It's we want the ones that get us out of our seat and and give us some exciting racing. But yeah, we'll see if there's anything that can be done about it. But no, I mean, fantastic insights into Monaco. I kind of want to go to the swimming pool section now and watch some qualifying, but maybe next year.
I mean, it's a no-brainer, Richard. You've got to get your media pass, get down as close as you can get. You will. The ground shakes. I mean, it is just. I mean, it is nuts. I mean, to go through that area in a modern car, the speed they're going, I don't know, probably about 140, 50 miles an hour at the quick left-right flick. I mean, it's just barking mad.
Wow. I mean, people always ask me which is the one Grand Prix I'd love to go to. I always say Monaco, and they always think I'm crackers. What you've just said is why. That's why, because it's margins for error, and cars shouldn't be going that quick right there. And I'd love to see it.
The thing with Monaco is it's out of its time in relation to contemporary circuits.
Yeah,
it is a racetrack that has still got a lot of echo from 1929, when I think Williams might have been the name of the driver, a British driver, won in a Bugatti Type 35, I think it might have been. Tires about as thick as that finger, they were a little wider than my finger, and it was a race that probably lasted 3 or 4 hours. Incredible. In the blistering heat. But also there was a time when you're coming into the hotel, into the sort of the casino square, you could take your hand off the wheel and wave at somebody in the grandstand, maybe a friend, or maybe even you might have even waved at a woman. Gee, I mean, you couldn't do that today.
Absolutely not. Yeah, fantastic. I mean, just something different about the place. I'd love to do it. Something different. While we're on the subject of like street circuits, it kind of just leads us back to where we were before. In F2. Rouen, correct me if I'm wrong, was it 1970 you had on the old street circuit there, or the old road course at Rouen, where you had a crash and injured yourself?
Yes.
You broke your leg. I didn't realise this until I was like really researching this chat. Was that your first introduction really to Mr. Eccleston, and he flew you back?
Okay, what happened?
Like that was it?
The cause of the accident was I picked up a puncture, and I hadn't realised because it was a slow puncture, and Rouen was a phenomenal racetrack. I mean, the downhill section from the pits down to the hairpin. Yeah. I mean, the image of Fangio going through there in a 250F Maserati in 1957, opposite lock, balancing the car on the steer, and that's Rouen. But again, it was a very dangerous circuit, certainly by today's standards.
Yeah, there was some
on the climb back up the other side of the valley. The final corner was a very fast. It was a flat out right-hand corner onto then what would have been the auto route before you came then to the next leg back to the pit straight. And going through the corner, I just settled the car into the corner. All of a sudden, bang, and the tire had the bead of the tire had broken away from the sidewall had broken away from the bead, and it just immediately out of control, hit the barrier, bang one side, bang the other side. So I ended up with my arm broken. You see that there?
Yeah.
What's that? What's that? What's that there?
That's your wrist.
My wrist. Well, I had a second wrist here.
Oh, lovely.
I was hanging down from there, hanging down. So I woke up, and I looked up, and I went, "Oh shit!" So I did this, pushed it back together, and put it in my lap, and I tried to get out of the car. And I couldn't because I'd hurt my leg. My left leg had a bone fracture as well. And I remember, I think it was Joe Sifford stopped and came and see if I was okay. And I was fine. I just had a somewhat badly broken arm and leg. And then eventually that took me off to the local hospital, which in itself wasn't a particularly pleasant experience. Mm. But anyway, to cut long story short, I'm not quite sure how it all happened, but Bernie had bought, because he's a dealer and whatever, and he and Jochen were effectively business partners. They'd bought a couple of aircraft, and one of them was at the airport at Rouen. And somehow or other, and I don't know the true story, but I was able to be ferried back from Rouen direct back to Belfast with my father, who had just turned up just after the accident occurred. So yes, I mean, okay, it wasn't a freebie, but the point of it was they enabled me and my father to return to normality, to a hospital in Belfast where I would get the treatment that was appropriate. And I was obviously grateful, and my family were grateful that the offer had been made, and got me back to Belfast.
Fantastic. And obviously, your paths crossed with Bernie a bit later, which again we'll come to. Crikey, I mean, and sort of through the early 70s, you did you did a few races in F2. You joined Alan McCall's team and had like a full like a part season, I guess, in sort of 73 and 74. Was that just I mean, were they part seasons purely, was it like a funding issue, or was it what was the situation there around those teams?
At the end of 71, there was a formula change. They went from 1.6 litre Cosworth FVA to a 2 litre BDF or BDA, whatever they called it. So it was a new car, new motor. And we were a small family team, and just frankly, we weren't able to continually fund. So it looked like my adventure, my 2-year or 1.5-year adventure, was going to come to a conclusion. So I was back in Northern Ireland, and obviously my desire was to find a route back into motor racing, professional motor racing. Alan McCall, who had made the Tui, and it was just a truly beautiful one-off Formula 2 car. It was basically modeled on a McLaren M7. It was like a mini me version of a McLaren M7. His driver at the time was Bert Hawthorne. Bert Hawthorne sadly lost his life in an accident, I believe, at Hockenheim. So Alan found himself with the equipment and nobody to drive. And I'm not sure, again, I think it might have been some journalist colleagues who said to Alan, or actually maybe to Brian Hart, Brian Hart was providing the engines to Alan McCall for his car. John's doing nothing. Give him a call, see if he would like to drive. Right. So I got a call literally out of the blue a few days before Crystal Palace. Would you be up for driving in the Formula 2 Crystal Palace, whatever the weekend was? It was a bank holiday weekend. You couldn't hold me back. I mean, I was over there in a flash. Jumped into the car, having never sat in it until I got there, having never driven it before. I'd driven at Crystal Palace in 1970. I liked Crystal Palace. It was another quirky, but just a real great little place. You could grab it. So the Tui I drove, I thought was fantastic. And just to be back into a race car that was competitive and being able to go racing. So there was no, for me, it was I was doing it on the basis of turn up and drive, and I think maybe I got a percentage of whatever money was earned through results, but there was certainly nothing that would have enabled me to drive around in anything other than maybe a little. I think I had a little Toyota Corolla,
right?
1968 Toyota Corolla. That was my road car at that time, and I drove it to some events throughout Europe as well. Wow. But Alan gave me that opportunity and resurrected the career that had stalled out at the end of 1971.
So it just kind of got you sort of back in the game, I guess.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
And it was 1973 again. Just from looking in the research and everything, you kind of what's the phrase? I guess you sort of like dip your toes into the world of endurance racing, sports cars, prototypes, that kind of a thing. And you raced with obviously with the great Mike Hailwood, and absolute incredible racer on 2 wheels and 4. But was it the Daytona 24 Hours in 73? Daytona's a place I'd love to go to because the banking is absolutely crazy, and it's just got a kind of like the same aura about it as Indianapolis does out in the States. I mean, what was it like racing there?
Well, Daytona, the first time I drove into the stadium at Daytona, and I realized just how mighty a racetrack. I mean, in those days, we didn't have the chicane on the back straight. So it was just a blast out of turn 2 all the way down into 3 and 4, and then you come back into the infield section. I mean, I went, oh my God, what have I done? I mean, and I drove around in my rent car, and I thought, I can't do this. But eventually, after a lap or 2 laps, you sort of realized that the centrifugal forces kept the car on the racetrack. I mean, at one point, I achieved what I needed to do in the rent car, and I wanted to take a photograph to show the folks back home just how steep this was. So I parked the car in the high lane at the middle of turn 3 and 4, got out, walked to the bottom of the banking to take a photograph. And one of the corner workers or marshals at Daytona screeched to a halt, said, "Hey, guy, get that bleep, bleep, bleep car out of here now." What have I done? Get it out of here now. Because I don't know what it was, but it just to see the car. I mean, I think it's a 33-degree banking.
It's crazy.
And it was just, I just wanted to take a memory of what it was like. Yeah. And then once I'd done it, I mean, it was just a walk in the park. In the race car, it was fundamentally flat out from the minute you got into the car. No problem whatsoever.
Wow. It's incredible. And did you get the photo? Did you?
I do. I think I may have it somewhere. I did get a photograph. I mean, it was. I don't know what was worse, going down the banking or trying to get back up the banking, because it is quite steep. I mean, I think it's 33-degree banking.
I mean, that is steep, isn't it? I mean, because that's the thing about Indianapolis. People talk about the banking. It's only about 11 or 12 degrees, but Daytona is crazy. And yeah.
Well, Daytona is a proper banked oval racetrack. Indianapolis is 4 separate corners, and I think each one's got a slightly different degree of banking.
Yeah, to a half degree.
It's on this weekend. I've been watching all the practice and qualifying from it. I mean,
I'm so excited about it.
Speeds entering turn 1 or turn 3 at 238 miles an hour.
200, yeah.
Nuts.
Unreal. I mean, was it the qualifying average was 232 or something?
No, it is. I mean, that is a major challenge. And I mean, the circuit is 4 different corners, and it's wind affected, it's temperature affected, it's tire degradation affected. I mean, there's so many factors come into winning Indy or running Indy, let alone winning it.
Yeah.
And what you've got to do at Indy, you've got to be around for the last half hour. And the race is really about that final half hour. That's where the race is usually won. It's the
last 30 odd laps, isn't it? That's the one that.
Yeah.
That's where you want to be. But I mean, obviously, I always shoehorn the Indy 500 into every chat because I love it. I went there last year for the first time, and it's just absolutely incredible. And people talk about it just, you're just turning left, you're just going around in circles and blah, blah, blah. And it's not this. And until you actually go and witness it, you don't understand how fast they're going, how close they are to the barriers. The wind changes direction every 2 or 3 minutes, and that can lift the car and unsettle it. It's incredible, isn't it? It's just an absolutely incredible race.
Well, I went to Indy. Penske team in 1977 invited me to come out to see the race, and I stood in the pit lane, and the speed of the cars coming out of turn 4 into turn 1, I couldn't turn my neck quick enough to follow the cars. It was just, and that was in 77. Now, the cars today, I don't know how much quicker they are in a straight line, probably 10, 15 miles an hour or more.
Yeah.
And it's the whole essence of Indianapolis. It's all about this now, this very, very subtle fine tuning. All they call them the tools you've got in the cockpit, your weight jackers, so many things they can adjust. And they're doing it maybe every corner to get the optimum performance out of the car. Taking wing out, single lap it's usually a 4-lap run, average of 4 laps. Then in the race, you want to put more wing in. Can you overtake? I mean, it looks a very simple race, but it's far from simple. And I tell you, the people that are doing it, especially the teams, are extremely clever and understanding of the issues that arise at Indy.
Yeah, I mean, I've been fortunate enough to speak with a number of guys who actually won the race. Guys like Danny Sullivan, Ariel Irondike, and Mario, and spoke with Will Power. So loads of different, and they all said the same thing. Excuse me, and it's just, I mean, it's as you say, they're kind of tweaking the car and they're playing with it every corner. So there's 4 corners that look the same and they're all different to drive, but they're going through the short shoot between turns, I don't know, 2 and
1 and 2 and 3 and 4,
like between 1 and 2, 3 and 4, and they're playing with settings on the car, and they're doing 240 miles an hour that far from a wall, and you think, It's just
And,
incredible.
Richard, don't forget, they've also got their spotters stood up very high on one of
up on the roof.
On the roof, and the spotters are giving them information as to whether there's somebody in your outside or somebody up your in. So they're not having just to deal with what they're doing behind the wheel, driving the car. They're getting somebody going yak, yak, yak in their ear, saying stay high, stay low, or whatever. And if you ever have worked in broadcasting and you're doing a live broadcast and you've got a TV production gallery, you will have people in that gallery talking to you, giving you information or maybe an instruction or whichever, at the same time as you're trying to describe something that's going. So you have to have this ability. And if you just quite simply watch newsreaders on television at nighttime, they're reading an auto cue, which in itself is not an easy thing to do. But equally, they've got somebody in the rear saying, hold on, there's breaking news. We're going to have to break away from this interview. We're going to do. And those are skills, what the skill the racing driver has to be able to take on board that information coming in. And it may not necessarily come in at a particularly convenient time on a lap.
Yeah. And there's so much, but then there's some people saying, oh, well, but they need someone to tell them what's happening. And yeah, because everything's happening so bloody quickly. You need someone.
Well, I tell you, they're doing the length of a football pitch every second, I think, when they're at full speed. That's the sort of measurement that you're having to deal with.
Was it 350 feet a second or something?
Something like that. It's just nuts.
Which is like the blink of an eye, and it's incredible. But yeah, I love it, and I can't wait for Sunday. I'm so excited.
Well, I mean, look, this great weekend. Sunday, you got Monte Carlo or Monaco. You got Indy. You got British GT this weekend as well. I think it's at Donington or something.
It is, yeah.
It's a busy weekend for motorsport in the UK, or availability of motorsport on television.
Absolutely. My wife's not going to get a look in. She's got no chance. But yeah, I mean, as I said, I'm a Penske man, have been for years. So yeah, we'll come to Penske soon. But yeah, fantastic stuff. Just very quickly, I wanted to that year, 73 again. You correct if I'm wrong. It was your first trip to the 24 hours of that race in France. I always ask people who have raced in it, what's the atmosphere like there that weekend? Because obviously it's a great thing for the fans to sit there and have a barbecue and watch the racing for 24 hours. I mean, it's a completely different challenge, isn't it, to anything else?
Yeah,
it's such a unique event.
Well, I mean, I went to Le Mans as a punter, as a spectator, in 1964, first year of the GT40s. I mean, it was awesome. I mean, just to see the factory Fords, Ferraris, whatever else. And I'm a Porsche person. I love Porsche. To see the 904s racing for the first time.
Wow.
To hear an Alfa Romeo TZ1 bellowing its way. To watch MGBs, Triumph Spitfires. I don't know I can't remember whatever else was there in the race. But it was the spectacle at that time of Le Mans. For me, was just unbelievable. Watching going through the Dunlop curve without the chicane as we have today, down into the S's, out of the S's down towards Tertre Rouge, where that whole funfair area used to exist. Yeah. You could take a knife and cut a slice of the atmosphere and enjoy it. Now, when I went there in 73, I was going as a competitor. It was a different atmosphere, different environment. It was I'd had a shunt at Brands Hatch in 73, broke my leg. So it was my first race back. And the Gulf team felt possibly the best deal would be to bring in an additional driver to the car Mike Hilbert and I were sharing. So Vern Schuppen was given the invitation, and Vern was the third driver. I don't think I did a good job on my return. I think it would have, under normal circumstances, would have done a better job. So I was carrying a leg that had been a double compound fracture. And it was your right leg, so it's not so much the throttle, but the braking leg. And maybe I didn't perform at the level I would have naturally assumed I would have performed at. But if whatever happened anyway, in the race, somewhere in the evening, when Vern was behind the wheel, he went off the road at Tertre Rouge, and car ended up upside down or something, whatever. So our race ended probably about a little more than a quarter to a third of the way through. And so that was disappointing. The thing that the John Wyer automotive team did, and this is something I don't know whether it applies today in the same way, but because the success that John Wyer had with Aston Martins at Le Mans, then with the 917s, then hoping with the Mirage likewise. The team said, we want you to run at a preset time. We don't want you going out there to try and win the race or do a qualifying lap. We want you to run whatever, 4 minutes, whatever it might have been, or 3 minutes 50 or whatever, I can't remember. So they understood how you win a 24-hour race. 24-hour races today are different. 24-hour races today are not endurance. They are 24 one-hour sprint races. That's the difference. In 73, it was an endurance race. And the whole ethos of JW Automotive at that time was John Wire, known locally as Death Ray. That was his nickname, Death Ray. And John, well, he didn't mind. And John Horsman, who was effectively the de facto team manager of the team, and then others in the team as well. So we want Mike or John or whoever, Vern, we want you to do this lap time. We don't want you to be slower than it. We don't want you to be quicker than it, because we know that the way that you win Le Mans is metronomically.
That consistency.
So consistency, because in that way, the more than likely the race will come to you. Whereas if you try to go out and be, let's say, the rabbit rather than the tortoise, or the hare rather than the tortoise, you might break the car. And at that time, the Cosworth DFV or whatever derivative we had wasn't essentially an endurance engine. So we would run the engine, say, to 9,000 RPM, whereas the Formula One spec engine would be running to over 10,000. Hewland gearbox wasn't essentially a gearbox that was designed as an endurance gearbox. It was designed to be a gearbox for single-seater racing. So we were given this, predetermined pace to set at, and I think essentially that's what we did. But that year, in particular, the Matra was winning everything. The Matra was an outstanding car, great overall package, aerodynamically, V12 engine was great. Then the next quickest car was the Ferrari 312 PB or whatever it was, which was effectively the Formula One car with a two-seater sports car body on it. So they were the second quickest, and then we were third of those three. So we couldn't beat either of the two on pace. So what we had to try and do was just go in, do our lap times, mitigate all the time in the pits, don't lose time, don't damage the car, don't just bring the car in, clean pit stops, back out again, just repeat it and repeat it and repeat it.
Try to outlast them almost.
More or less, yes.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, the Matra could be driven faster, harder, and was ultimately more reliable and won the race in 73.
Yeah, sure. Wow. Times changed, and obviously with the technology, cars are more reliable now, and
the reliability of cars, engineering and reliability has transformed motor racing.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll come back to Le Mans a bit later, because you've driven some of my favourite cars ever in Le Mans. I definitely want to come to those in the 80s. But it was 73, then into 74. That was your first sort of taste of F1, wasn't it? And I mean, what was good? Because obviously you'd done some endurance racing in 73, some F2, things like that. Was it Paul Michaels you got on board with? How did all that come to be? And had F1 been on your radar?
All right, let me go back a couple of years. In 1972, there was a Formula One entrant called Team Eifelland, German caravan manufacturing company, and they bought a March 721 and then had it redesigned by a very clever engineer, designer, aerodynamicist, and generally, off the wall kind of guy called Enzo Coloni. And he redesigned the bodywork with a very swoopy style of aerodynamics. Notable that it had what I would call a large periscope mirror right in front of the driver. So literally there in front of your eye line was this periscope mirror, had a bodywork that came around, and the sides of the bodywork incorporated an air box that fed air into the engine. Okay. So it was very clever. The car was a good car, but it wasn't as competitive as others around. And eventually the team got disbanded. And again, that man, Eccleston, found himself in the middle of the negotiations. So he had either acquired it or was acting as the broker for it. And he ended up selling the car to a motor dealer from Dublin, who was known as Monkey Brown. He wasn't christened Monkey, but his name was christened Anthony. He was Tony Brown, but he was Tony Monkey Brown. And Monkey had bought this car, and I get a call from somebody I'd never heard of, and I thought, it's a Southern Irish voice, and I thought, bloody hell, who's this? Anyway, he said, to be sure, would you drive the car at Phoenix Park for me? It all came out like, brrr. So I said, yeah, why not? So the car, I went over to Dublin, and the car eventually, I think, turned up on the Saturday on the back of a flatbed truck. Nobody there to really run it. So somehow or other, between myself, my mate David, and one or two other people, we fired it up. We got it to run. And then I drove the car on Saturday, first time in a Formula One car. Phoenix Park is not somewhere I would recommend anybody would drive a Formula One car for the first time.
Not the place
and
to
if
start.
anybody's ever been to Phoenix Park or driven the racetrack, they would probably understand. In fact, I think one of our former FIA presidents, Max Mosley, Max was racing Formula 2 in 1970, must have been 70, around 71, 72. And he'd come to Phoenix, maybe it was even earlier than that. Anyway, he'd come to Phoenix Park to race. And he drove around the circuit. I think it might have been a wet weekend. And he decided this place is just ridiculous. It's so bloody dangerous. I'm not going to race. But I mean, a big stupid lump like me never thought about it. Jumped in the car and drove it. And I mean, it wasn't a bad car. So the car went back to England, and Monkey Brown somehow or other spoke to Paul Michaels, who ran a business called Hexagon of Highgate. And between the pair of them, and with the assistance of Bernie Eccleston, they managed to get an entry for the last Formula One race of the season, I think it was, called the Victory Race at Brands Hatch.
Yes.
And the idea was that I would drive the car. And at this point, I think I'd either about to or just signed an agreement with Bernie. So the car was taken to Hexagon's workshops. They took it apart and they said, listen, John, that car was in a really bad condition.
Right.
You shouldn't have been driving it at Phoenix Park.
Really?
Because some of the ball joints, let's put it this way, they didn't show me them probably just as well. So they prepared the car. They did a really excellent job on the preparation of the car, and using only the people that Paul had, his own mechanics from the business. We went up to Silverstone prior to this to do the shakedown and run. And the factory March team were there. And I'm trundling around Silverstone, and all of a sudden the March guys are coming in. What are you guys doing? You're quicker than we are. So a compliment to Hexagon.
Wow.
Went to Brands Hatch, and it was a October weekend. Race day was damp, wet, and so everybody started on wet tires. And I think maybe one or two might have changed, I can't remember, but anyway, I stayed on wet tires and I ended up finishing 6th. So I felt that's a rather good result for Hexagon, good result for me. Yeah. And again, in a car that probably most people would have overlooked, it washed its face, and it helped me, and it then encouraged Paul to become an entrant. So he negotiated a deal with Bernie, wherein he acquired one of the 1973 factory BT42 Brabhams,
yes,
which then was going to be entered. It wasn't a quasi factory car entry. There was an independent entry, but with the sort of association with Bernie. So the car came, and again, it was a bit tired when it arrived at Hexagon. So they had to do a lot of work on it to get it into a fit and proper condition to start at the 74 season. Alan McCall rejoined Alan, and Alan came in, and he did some re-engineering in the car, which I know didn't go down particularly well, I think, with Gordon Murray at Brabham, because it went away from the BT42 concept.
Sure.
But Alan wasn't the kind of person that was going to be, worried about that very much. And we set off and started in Argentina and did the full calendar. And then I think at the end of July, beginning of August, Paul persuaded Bernie to let us have the BT44, which was the car that the factory were running at that time. And that was wow.
That was the game changer.
The first time I had driven what I would call a competitive Formula One car. And the difference between the 42 and the 44 was chalk and cheese. And all of a sudden, I mean, I wasn't doing any more in the 44 than I was doing the 42, but all of a sudden I'd elevated myself up the grid by about 6 or 7 places.
Wow.
And that's the difference between having a good car and struggling in a car that isn't as competitive. And look, if you look at contemporary Formula One, I wonder how many drivers, if you took out of a car that's at the middle or the back of the grid and put them into a Red Bull, okay, it's a big act to follow, and following in Max's or even Perez's shoes. But when you drive a car, I mean, just let's take it another way. Let's put Lewis into a Red Bull. Let's put Fernando into a Red Bull.
Yeah.
Would Max still win every race, or would Perez be right on his tail, beating Max on occasion? I tell you what, I would love to see Hamilton or Alonso, or maybe others also, in a Red Bull.
In absolutely equal machinery.
And actually, as teammates to Max.
Yes.
Let's play devil's advocate.
A 4-car team.
No, I don't want a 4-car
team.
I just want 2-car team.
Absolutely, yeah, agreed.
I mean, I tell you what, if Lewis got into a Red Bull, his jaw would hit the ground.
Yeah.
In disbelief of the level of difference in performance to his present car and what Red Bull have got.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that was the difference that I found when I drove the 44 after the 42. Suddenly, I can actually still drive a Formula One car. I actually can be competitive.
Yeah.
And that's where driving a really good car helps, and being in a mediocre or a back of the grid car, you do your best, but there's a limit to what the car will enable you to do.
Yeah, and I guess it affects the mindset as well. Thinking, oh crikey, I can be competitive in this, which obviously changes the way you approach things, right? I did hear, again, research and listening to things. Was there for 75? Was there sort of mumblings that there might be a 2-car team? I read somewhere that Beltoise might have been coming in with the Gitan tobacco sort of sponsorship. Was that ever going to happen, or was it just one of these urban myths?
No, it had been a conversation piece.
Okay.
I wasn't directly involved in it, but Paul had been, and I think people were impressed with the professionalism of Paul's team. I mean, Hexagon of Highgate is a at that time was a Porsche, North London Porsche dealer, and very successful dealer in historic racing cars and road cars and whatever. But people have thought, well, that's a small team doing a very good job. And then the obvious next step would have been to expand into a 2-car team. But then you started to need full commercial backing, because Hexagon was a small operation, and in relative terms, it was a small budget. But to do a 2-car team, it meant more people, it meant bigger facilities, it meant everything was going to scale up.
Yeah.
So you needed commercial backing. And Beltoise, and I think it might have been Mutual, I'm not sure. No, maybe it was Gitan, might have been Gitan. Unfortunately and sadly, it didn't come to anything. And ultimately, and at the back end of 1974, Paul said, look, I'm sorry, John, I can't continue.
Right.
Which was a massive disappointment, because I felt that Hexagon could have gone on one Grand Prix, because the BT44 was such a good car. And if we had been able to get then the BT44B upgrades, we would have been in a very strong position.
Yeah.
So that didn't happen. And it's a great regret of Paul, and I know it was a disappointment on my part.
Yeah.
So I was left, coming up to Christmas, a few days before Christmas, suddenly I don't have a car to drive. I'm out of racing again.
Another potential knockback, I guess. But did you have many options for 75?
No.
Because obviously, I'll let you explain where you went and why. But there wasn't much on the table at all.
No, pretty much every seat had been filled, with one exception. In 74, I'd driven for John Surtees in Formula 2, so we'd worked together, and I liked John a lot. I felt we got on very well. But his Formula One season, 74, 73, had not been great seasons. And he rang up and said, listen, I know you're out of a drive. Would you consider driving for me? We're going to run a single car entry. Would you drive for me in Formula One? I said, John, can't wait.
Yeah, like ripped his arm off. Yeah.
Yeah, because again, going back to, I've always had the view that you're better to be seen racing and doing your best and whatever the equipment is than sitting back home waiting for the call to come from McLaren, Brabham, Lotus, Tyrrell, or whatever.
Sure. Yeah.
So I took that opportunity as a one-car Surtees entry, and it wasn't the most competitive car, but it was a car that got me back at the races, and I hope I did a good job. I mean, but again, going back to Montjuïc Park,
It was
that
the best
car,
result,
I
wasn't it?
just loved that place. And I locked up a brake going into the hairpin at the end of whatever lap it was, and flat spotted the tire so badly I had to make a pit stop. But certainly I could have had a podium in that car, in that race. Look, I finished second in the Race of Champions behind Tom Price when he was driving for Shadow. I remember overtaking Ronnie Peterson up into Druids.
Wow.
And I know that Colin Chapman was so pissed off that as Surtees had passed his Lotus, he was fit to be tied.
He was fuming.
Not just a Lotus, but one driven by Ronnie.
Yeah.
I don't believe it.
How can that happen?
Passed I can't believe. I mean, I'm going like this. Chunky, he was known as Chunky, was absolutely off the radar.
Absolutely fuming. Excellent. I mean, obviously that kind of fateful race at like Montjuïc, I've got here was the best result of the year, which is 8th, and you said it could have been a podium.
Yeah, I mean that should have been a podium, but there is everything's a bit if and or a but.
Yeah, all ifs and buts. And I remember I've seen images of the car. It's a fantastic looking thing, blue and yellow. Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah, there was Matchbox toys, branding, color
branding.
Yeah,
terrific looking thing. Which is great. Also, we've covered the the events of like Montjuïc. Obviously, John, he didn't enter all races, did he? There were a couple of races from Ron. Was it Germany and
Italy? Yeah, it was the German and Italian Grand Prix. He didn't. He was either withdrew or he didn't go, whichever one it was. Yeah. And as a consequence, the German Grand Prix on the Nordschleife, the two Lotus entries would have ordinarily been Ronnie in one car and Jackie Eakes in the second car. But from what I believe, Jackie felt that the Lotus was no longer sufficiently competitive for a driver of his stature, particularly at Nürburgring.
Right.
And he didn't want to trail around in a car that wasn't going to be competitive or had a chance to win. So he stepped down, and maybe arguably from the performance I put in at Brands Hatch.
Yeah.
I got the offer. So I got an offer. I don't know who it was, Peter War probably rang up and said, look, Johnny, would you like to drive for us this weekend? We've got a seat available. And again, out of the box like a bloody greyhound to get over to Nürburgring.
I couldn't get there quick enough. Yeah.
Burned rubber, sniffed petrol the whole way.
Yeah. It was a terrific car. I mean, it's one of the most recognizable cars of the year. That Lotus from that year, and on the Nordschleife as well. It's not a bad weekend gig. Well, I guess they call it now.
Let me just go through a little bit. I'll go through it quickly because I know I drag on a bit sometimes. But again, I hadn't driven the car till I got to Nürburgring. So at Nürburgring, there's got a little link between when you go out onto the full circuit and coming back onto pit straight.
Yes.
So that's how I got to drive the car, feel it for the first time. And then eventually I'd go out and do a full lap. And Ronnie was pounding around in his car and coming in, making changes, going back out again. Oh, it's better, it's worse, whatever. So I would do my maybe 3 flying laps, come in. And as soon as I stopped, Colin's head was in the car. What's it doing, John? What's the understeering? I said, Colin, just let me. I haven't reached anywhere approaching the limit of the car. I'm not going to start making changes. Then I think I probably made virtually no changes to the car at all. And funnily enough, I ended up quicker in qualifying than Ronnie, who had made a myriad of changes.
There you go.
Sometimes, just getting in, driving the car on a circuit like Nürburgring, with such a long circuit, such a variety and whatever of corners.
Yeah.
Probably if I made a wing change, I'd be surprised. And the pace was there. The car wasn't at the pace of, let's say, Ferrari with Niki or Scheckter in the Tyrrell. They were both, pretty quick at that time. They were doing low 7 minutes, maybe a high 60, 6 minutes 59 or something. But anyway, we're in the race, and I'm not sure, maybe on the second or third lap, just after Flugplatz, which is a quick one of those places you take, and you sort of momentary fly. Then it's a double right-hand corner, which is just about tippy toes. Then you go through a long sequence of left-hand corners before you come to a tighter left, then goes down into the foxhole. And coming through this long sequence, something in my eye, peripheral vision, picked up that the outside, the right wheel was starting to do this.
Oh, toe in.
That's towing out. It was leaning out. And I thought, it's not meant to do that. And I could see that something on that front top wishbone had failed. So I just backed out of it, pulled the car over to the side of the track, stopped, and that was my German Grand Prix finished.
Wow. Well, it's a good job you spotted it by the sounds of it.
But look, when you're racing, everybody's sense is so heightened by adrenaline. So your eyesight, your smell, your hearing. Listen, if you fart in a race car, bang, you'll smell it. It's just such an instant.
It's magnified.
Everything's magnified. I mean, if I could take all the adrenaline in my body and have a mainline it every day, that would be heaven for me.
Wow.
Because adrenaline is the most amazing, naturally created stimulant that's known.
Absolutely.
I just love it to bits.
Yeah.
I have to artificially stimulate it. When I'm day to day, something will happen day to day, bang, an adrenaline rush. Yes.
Yeah. I had that. I drove an aerial Atom 2 weeks ago, and for about 4.5 minutes of my life.
It's a very fast car.
Especially for for like Joe Normal like me.
Whatever.
Me. Fantastic. I got that rush, and you just don't stop smiling for half an hour. Fantastic. So the end of. I just want to talk about something that happened in 1975, which sort of links into the next sort of step of your career. Mark Donoghue obviously was he. I guess you could say he was like the linchpin, wasn't he, of Penske, and the American driver in F1, and he was racing for Penske with Roger and everything, and was doing very, very well. And he was obviously very sadly lost at the what was the Österreich ring. Some of us know it. Obviously, you were in an era where that kind of a thing happened quite regularly. Obviously, we'd lost Surveyor and all these other guys. Where were you when you found out what had happened? Because obviously he died the following day, didn't he?
I think so. I mean, that was Austrian Grand Prix. Throughout the sort of 76 season, the team manager, a friend that became a great friend, one of my best friends, Heinz Hofer, you'd walk up and down the paddock and you'd stop and have a chat to team manager here or whatever else there. And I remember Heinz saying that, looking forward to 1976, that the team wasn't clear, put it that way, whether Mark would want to continue in Formula One. Okay. He'd done 74, part of 74, and done 75, and they'd gone from the Penske PC1, then they'd bought a March 751. The March was a quicker car, but I still think the PC1 was actually a much better car than maybe its results indicated. Okay. But Heinz had these conversations and said, if something happens, or look, give me a call. I'd love to talk to you about it. Hadn't anticipated that the call would come in the context that it did, because
of course
on the Sunday morning during the warm-up session, up through on the old circuit, pit straight, big steep climb, flat out to the right. I think it was the Hella Link was called the corner. It was really quick, and I believe there may have been a tire deflation or something. Anyway, Mark went off course, and there was a bit of a downslope on the outside of the corner. And of course, in those days, catch fencing was the safety mechanism. That was
the chain link with the metal, with the wood.
He somehow or other, a catch fence pole struck him on the head. Tragically, he was able to get out of the car, I believe, but taken to hospital and then passed away on the Monday. So, that's for Penske, for Roger, and for the Penske team. That was just probably the worst moment in the entire history of the Penske team,
I'm sure.
because Mark's contribution to what Penske's were doing from their sort of instigation in the 60s with Can-Am, with Trans Am, with IndyCar racing, with all the American series that they competed in, and then maybe 5,000 as well. And then coming into Formula One as a constructor in the middle of 1974, coming over to England, basing themselves down in Poole. And I mean, it was a small team of about a dozen people, and you know, as a Formula One was at that time.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, the talisman of the Penske team, Mark, suddenly
It's gone.
it's gone.
Wow.
I mean, it makes me. I mean, I'm talking about it now. It's it's quite an emotional thing to talk about.
I'm sure. Yeah, I'm sure it is. Yeah.
But, and this is where I think when you're a racing driver, you have to maybe be hard and accept that we were in at that time a profession where the dangers were massive compared to where we are today.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if you didn't feel that you wanted to challenge those dangers, then you didn't race.
Yeah.
So you had to accept that these things happen, but you have to believe. You have to believe in yourself. You have to believe in your car. You have to believe in the circuit safety. You have to believe in the medical backup. So we believed in that era, as bad as it is in reflection, that we were still in the safest era of Formula One.
Sure.
But accidents happened, and tragically, there were bad accidents and some fatalities. So communications were open between Roger and Heinz and myself, and we concluded a deal, which was I would then drive for Roger in the 75 USA Grand Prix at one of my all-time favorite circuits, Watkins Glen, in what was then the Penske PC3, and then drive for the team in 1974 as a full season championship contender.
Right. I mean, I've often wondered. Obviously, it's the All-American team. You know, it's a Penske team. The American driver suddenly Mark's not there. You made your debut in America as the British driver in the American team. Did you feel any nerves about it, or did it feel a bit odd that you'd stepped in that circumstance into the American Grand Prix?
I think it was quite a big moment, because the sponsors of the team, First National City Travelers Checks, was, I mean, it was a big event for the sponsor. I mean, a big event for Roger anyway, big event for the sponsors. And they would, I don't know how many guests they brought along. And the head of that sponsor was a man called Fred Stecker, who was a larger than life personality. And I mean, if Fred was the other side of the room, you wouldn't miss him, because he was a big guy and you would hear him. And I mean, just a real character, a real personality. So there were a lot of different pressures than any I'd ever previously experienced. I'd never been in a race team with that level of what I would call proper commercial sponsorship. I mean, the Gulf team was sponsored by Gulf Oil, but the Travelers Check sponsorship was a commodity that the punter would buy. If you wanted to travel overseas, you'd get First National City Bank Travelers Checks. And that's, in those days, you didn't take cash, you'd get your Travelers Checks and then go to a bank in the country you were going to and cash in your Travelers Check. So it was a big commercial element to something which, competing in the Grand Prix, it's an important Grand Prix for Roger. And I hoped that I could manage to do a decent job. And again, bedeviled by, I don't like to say bad luck, because I've always tried to avoid that phrase, bad luck or luck. But on the outlap, to go to the grid, something on the car, I think it might have been a gearbox problem. Like, you've got to be joking.
Yeah. You
have got to be joking. So Roger, who is the arch pragmatist in terms of thinking on his feet and let's get this done, do this. The Penske PC1 was sitting in the pit lane, had never been run in practice. I'd never sat in the car. So I remember I was like, get John out, get him in PC1. So they had to the guys had suddenly got to readjust the seat belts for me, adjust the pedals for me, adjust this. all of a sudden, all this is going on in a sort of a very short space of time.
Yeah.
I jump into the car, do an out lap onto the grid and start the Grand Prix.
Oh. You did one out lap and wow, that's amazing. I mean, goodness me, what a start!
But what I got out of that race, believe it or not, were 2 fractured ribs, because the seat that was in the car, which was fundamentally the seat Mark would have used, there was it caught me here, just above the bottom of the rib cage, and you're leaning on it in the corner, it dug in. Now I know that the hours and the days following that, I was in a lot of pain, because the rib itself doesn't hurt; it's the muscles between the rib, the intercostal muscles.
Yeah.
I mean, just breathing, it's like somebody was stabbing you every time you breathe. And wow. I had to do a 2-day test following that race at Watkins Glen.
With the rib injury?
With the rib injury. Now, I didn't realize I'd broken the ribs until about 2 years later, I was doing a medical, for my license, and for some reason did an x-ray, and the radiologist said, "When did you break your ribs?" I said, "I've never broken a rib in my life." "John, you've got callousing on 2 of your ribs. You've broken those 2 ribs." And that's when it happened.
Wow. So it took the full 2 years to.
Well, I knew it. I didn't know I'd broken them. All I knew is I got this. I thought it was just a muscular thing.
Yeah.
Which was that was the symptom, but the actual injury was 2 ribs had been fractured, and it was the injury to the muscles between the ribs that was causing the pain.
Wow, amazing. But obviously, it didn't put you off going there for the full year.
No. I mean,
the following year.
I mean, driving for Roger and what the Penske team was, its aspirations, its ambitions, and whatever. It was the first time that, in reality, I was competing in what I would call, on a season-long basis, professional team. I mean, what I did with what Hexagon did was fantastic, but that was an independent team. John was a factory car, but it was a single car effort. 76 was a different deal altogether. And here is the Penske organization with everything they have got back in Reading, Pennsylvania. I mean, one of the things they had was a massive skid pad just outside the workshops. And Mark used to use that skid pad because Mark was not just a racing driver, he was a very clever engineer. And I mean, at one point it was the McLaren M14, whatever. McLaren couldn't, they had a funny rising rate suspension on it, and they couldn't work it out. Mark worked it out, made his car, the Penske sponsored car, quicker than the factory cars. So Mark was an exceptional man, engineer as well as race driver. And I'm driving around the skid pad without any bodywork on, because the thing he would do is take the bodywork off, drive it around the skid pad and work out the mechanical component in the car.
Right.
And when he'd got that satisfactorily resolved, then he put the bodywork on, and then he would work on the aerodynamics.
On the aero side.
So it was. I wasn't an engineer. I was a race driver. Yeah. So I would go on the skid pad, and I'd just go understeer. I said, "Look, this is not for me." And at that point, the March 751 and then the PC3 had very similar aero nose bodywork, whatever. I said, "Look, let me just try and adjust the car without going through this particular procedure." But for someone like Mark, who was an engineer and who actually understood what was going on, and he was really the person that was engineering that car as much as any of the engineers that were within the team. Wow. Whereas I was a racing driver, and all I would try to do is communicate to my engineering team what the car I felt was doing, but I didn't tell the team what to do to improve it. I left it up to the team.
Right.
Unlike my more illustrious teammate, Lauda, who engineered the car when he's driving around, come in and say, "Okay, more front wing, less rear wing, roll bar up, whatever." Nicky would do all that stuff.
He'd do it all.
And Nicky was his, and he was exceptionally good at doing it too.
Approach. Amazing. It's great to hear of these drivers that were sort of, more mechanically minded as well. Just into 76, obviously, the PC4 came along and things seemed to get better. He had some podium finishes. Excuse me. Where were we? Paul Ricard, Brands Hatch. So obviously things are going in the right direction, and things like that.
Can I stop you again, Richard? Just stop you again. I started the season in PC3.
Yeah.
There was then a technical change where rear wings had to come forward, big air boxes went, and the aero balance of the car changed significantly.
Right.
And again, Roger felt maybe that PC3, its expectancy was that we'd reached the point where it wasn't going to get really any better. And Jeff Ferris, who had been Roger's designer and who designed PC1, was then instructed to design PC4, which he did. And that car, I think, was introduced in Sweden. And initially, we struggled with the car. So Roger, again, I use this word pragmatic or pragmatist. Roger would walk up and down the pit lane and he'd walk past an M23 McLaren and he'd see there's a big spacer between the engine and the gearbox. And he'd look at somebody else, a set of normal, sort of what I call canard front wings, not one big sort of Ferrari-style front wing. So he said, Jeff, go away, redesign that part, put a spacer in it, let's put a standard front wing assembly setup on it, which was what he did. He took the car to Paul Ricard for the French Grand Prix, transformed the car. Now, again, I'd have got a car with which it was competitive. I could race it the way I wanted to race it, and it made massive technical leap forward. And that's why we started to get the results. French Grand Prix, British Grand Prix, Germany wasn't so successful then, obviously leading to Austria.
Yeah, which obviously, given what had gone on there, what happened there the year
Previously
before,
1 year ago,
was obviously, I guess it may have been difficult going back for everyone. But
hold on. You have to put all that stuff behind you.
Of course,
I think for Roger it would have been difficult, maybe for Heinz, but you can't dwell. You've got to put that behind you. You can have your private moments.
Yeah.
And I'm sure many people in the team did do, but you're there to do a job and you cannot reflect or dwell on what happened a year ago.
Yeah, absolutely.
I know that sounds harsh, but that's how it is.
That's the necessity of the situation, isn't it? And yeah, you said you've got to do a job, and well, you did, didn't you? Really? I mean, it was that week. I mean, obviously the car was much better due to the changes that have been made. I guess you were confident going there, thinking we can have can have another good weekend. Did you think we can win this? Did you?
Okay, let me again go back to the beginning. We got to the circuit, and within the Goodyear hierarchy of tires, there was a certain teams were given first choice. Remember, these are cross-ply tires, or what used to call bias tires. And in the manufacturing process, it was very difficult to get two sets of tires equal circumference. And the teams that were given first dibs at going into the Goodyear truck, who they would measure every single tire to ensure they got matching rears and matching fronts. So anyway, we had our sets of tires, but over that weekend, don't understand why, but our tire guy, a guy from Northern Ireland called Jerry, found a set of tires, and those tires are the tires that I think qualified on, and I raced on, and the car, it was the best the car had ever been. And the race started, it was a damp track, patchy and damp. So up, I think it was on the front row of the grid, up the hill into Hellelinked with James Hunt on one side, and it's all tippy toes all through. I mean, 120 mile an hour, 30 miles an hour at that time, but in those conditions on the limit. And there was a lot of catching and passing and overtaking. But eventually, after maybe 15, 20 laps, I established the lead. And then I was able to control the race from the front. And the car was fantastic all the way through. And I mean, it was irony. And it's very difficult to put it into a logical sort of equation. We won the Austrian Grand Prix from a team that had lost. Say, I call Mark the team's talisman. They'd lost their talisman a year ago, and here they are returning to the scene of that tragic moment, and winning the Grand Prix.
Yeah, the complete opposite.
Could you make it up?
It's one of those amazing stories that sometimes I guess doesn't get mentioned enough. And that's still the last win for an American team.
Yes, it is
still last, right? I mean, so it's their first win. It's your first win. I mean, this might be a silly question, but when you win your first Formula One Grand Prix, I mean, this really is the pinnacle of motorsport, especially at the time. And you've won your first Grand Prix. It might be a silly question, but what's your? I mean, I've asked this to the people who have won the Indy 500 and who have won Le Mans, and they say you get about 50 emotions at once, and you don't know what to do with yourself. I mean, how did you feel when you got that first win in Formula One?
I mean, obviously, there's elation. It's a fulfillment of a dream in my case, certainly. But for me, it moved. It's history. It's in the record books now. You've done it. You can look at it. I mean, okay, I might have, if there was television, I might have been able to see it on a replay, or maybe on Wednesday evening on Sports View. They might have had some, going back to the 70s, because there was no actual live TV as we know it today.
Yeah.
But I moved on pretty quickly because I'd achieved my dream. I'd stood in the winner's podium. I've still got the trophy. It's in the house.
Oh,
fantastic. And then going back and talking to Roger and talking to Heinz and the team, and it was a moment in history for the Penske team, and they are the last American entrant in Formula One to win a Grand Prix. In fact, I'm going out to Detroit next weekend to the IndyCar race there. Penske have invited me out to be there because of lots of reasons. And in the course of a correspondence with Tim Cindric, who manages, I think he's the manager overall of Penske Racing.
Yeah,
they have
father of Austin, isn't he? He's Austin's father.
Yes, he is.
Yeah.
I think he could be. Anyway,
okay.
In the course of the correspondence, he was explaining that, sorry, John, you didn't make it into our top 12 Penske legends. No. And I wrote back and said, well, look, Tim, look, thank you very much. It's very flattering to be considered, whatever. But, on the same speech, I'm probably going to remain Penske's last Formula One Grand Prix winner.
Yeah, because they don't seem to have any designs on getting into it at the moment.
Tim wrote back and said, not necessarily.
Ooh.
No. That doesn't mean they're going to go into Formula One. It just means that it's not something has been ruled out.
Yeah.
No, I'm sure if I said that in Detroit next weekend, people are going to say, you shouldn't have said that. But it's just, I think that you look at the scale of the Penske organization.
It's huge. Yeah.
They are enormous. I mean, NASCAR, IndyCar, Roger owns Indy, he owns the series, and he's running now the Porsche Le Mans program, Porsche in the LMP version in North America.
He's got links to supercars in Australia, hasn't he?
He's got through Walkinshaw, through supercars, through Ryan Walkinshaw runs that.
Mm.
And I don't know whether the Penske team ever will return to Formula One, but it would be, I mean, the how would you say, the respect that the Roger and the Penske organization is held in by global manufacturers.
Yeah,
is probably bigger than any single individual in the world. I mean, it's off the radar.
It's a colossal organization, isn't it? They've got the racing shops and the haulage, and they've got everything.
The biggest trouble is you've got 10 teams in Formula One right now, and there's a pot of money, and they carve it up between themselves.
Yeah.
And if you bring in an 11th team, as Andretti has been trying to do, 11 tenths of 10 tenths is a lot less than 10 tenths of 10 tenths.
Yeah.
So it's all, I think, my view, and they can turn around and shoot me down if they want to, but if you bring in an 11th team, first of all, it would have to be at such an enormous level, I mean, comparable to maybe the top teams in Formula One today.
Yeah.
But do they really want to divide the pot by 11 tenths or whatever? Not sure that that's part of the game. It's a nice little game they've got going on, and everybody's doing very nicely indeed out of it. Thank you. But nothing would give me greater pleasure than to see an American team come in. I mean, currently we've got Haas, and they at different times do a very good job. But the scale of an organization such as Penske, and the access to manufacturers that they have got through their commercial outlets would be, I think, extremely exciting, and I would love to see it.
It'd be great
I'd love
to
see it in my lifetime, let alone anybody else's.
It'd be lovely to see. I've often wondered you know, if they were going to do it. Because, as I said, I'm a Penske fan. I've got my hang on, in fact, I've got my Team Penske T-shirt on. In tribute to you, John. But yeah, I mean, yeah, but what a fantastic thing to be able to do out in Detroit next. Yeah,
I mean, it just came out of the blue. I wasn't doing anything next weekend, and it was an opportunity to return to Detroit, to go back to a street circuit in Detroit, downtown Detroit, having had 20 odd years racing in Belle Isle.
Yeah.
So it's going to be based, I think, around the Renaissance Center where the original street track was based.
Excellent.
So that's what I understand. I haven't seen the layout of the circuit yet, so I'm only going by the few communications that I've had on that issue. So, I mean, it's a great weekend, and Detroit was great to me in 1982. So I'm over the moon about visiting or returning to the scene of, well, one of my few victories, but one that I suppose gave me a fair amount of satisfaction.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to come to that very soon. Just keep me on time. But just want to talk very quickly. I mean, we spoke about what we got here. Red Bull didn't take on Porsche. Perhaps we have Penske Porsche coming up. Oh, that's an interesting comment. That'd be good. Penske with Porsche power. My word.
I mean, listen, it's all part of VW, Audi, Porsche, whatever. And I don't know. I mean, the Red Bull Porsche discussions clearly were very advanced, and then all of a sudden it sort of it all unfolded, and I don't know what the reasons were. I mean, the technology that would exist within that organization would be, I mean, I think it'd be fantastic if Porsche were to return to Formula One. It'd be even greater if it was to be in a team run by Roger.
Yeah, absolutely. I think he'd definitely get it all working together, I'm sure. Just very quickly about Roger. You shaved your beard off, didn't you, after you won that race? You had because he wasn't a fan of beards. I seem to remember reading somewhere. He wasn't.
Okay, he had people in his team who did have beards, but the essence of the team would have been what I would have described as it was very. I mean, Roger brought a level of professionalism in terms of the visuals and the graphics and cars. So he, in a sense, broke new ground, and that was always a major part of the Penske's, whether it was again IndyCar or NASCAR or whatever car it was. And when I in these discussions with Roger, and I had my beard in '75, and I was aware that maybe he wasn't over the moon about it, but he never at any time said, "Would you shave your beard?"
Right.
I felt that maybe a way of doing it without anybody losing face would have been to say, "Well, Roger, when I win a Grand Prix, or when we win a Grand Prix, I promise you I will shave my beard."
Right.
So after Austria, so that Sunday night, flew back to London. Roger, Heinz, myself. Roger was flying back to the States on Monday morning, so we stayed overnight at Heathrow. I went up to the bedroom, went into the bathroom, got out a razor, and for the first time since 1968, I saw myself without a beard. And I tell you, it was a shock. It was a shock because if you remember, well, no, you don't, you're too young. But 1976 was an extremely warm summer, before anybody thought about global warming, by the way. And so my face was, a good color. But when I took the beard off, just pallid. Oh, blood! That's not a good look.
Two-tone.
Anyway, went to bed. Following morning, we agreed to meet in the coffee shop in the hotel, and I got down and was sitting at a table, inside the restaurant. And I remember Roger and Heinz walking in, and I heard Roger's voice. I said, "Hey, Heinz, where's Watson? Where's Watson?" Roger, over here. They didn't know where because they didn't think out of. So I couldn't wait to get rid of the damn thing. I've been wanting to get rid of it for over a year, but the opportunity only came in Austria on August weekend. So I sat there, and Roger was actually slightly, I think, taken aback by the speed of my side of the room.
Brilliant, amazing. I love the fact he didn't recognise you. Excellent. Just very quickly, I want to backtrack to something that happened, because obviously that Austria race was the first, I believe, the first Grand Prix after what happened at the Nürburgring with Nicky. And obviously you were on site pretty quickly when he had the accident, and suffered the burns and everything. Obviously, it's not something I want to particularly dwell on because it's not the nicest moment in motorsport history. But obviously, you were there with, what was it? Was it Brett Lunger and Guy Edwards and everything?
Yeah, Arturo Mazzario,
Yes.
Brett Lunger, Guy Edwards, and I think Harold Ertel.
Yeah.
Those are the four other competitors, and
I mean,
I'm not two of them. Maybe I think Lunger and maybe Ertel, or might have bumped into Nick as Nicky's car was coming across the track.
I think it was Lunger, wasn't it?
Yeah. And Mazzario was exceptionally courageous and jumped onto the side pods of Nicky's car to try and help him undo the seatbelts to help him get out of the car. I rocked up then maybe 10 seconds after all this, and there was, for some reason, there's a lot of what it looked like fluid on the racetrack. I didn't know whether it was fuel, water, whatever. So Nicky had literally just been almost dragged out of the car, and he was actually standing. And I said, look, I went down and I said, come on, let's get away from that car in case it reignites. So maybe walked 30 paces, 40 paces back. And I said, Nicky, look, lie down. So he lay down on the racetrack. I knelt down and put his head in my lap. So I'm sitting like this, looking down upon him. And he was badly burned. I mean, I can go into detail, but it wasn't something you'd really want to know about, or it wasn't pretty. But he looked up. I remember he said, what's my face look like? What's my face look like? And I said, don't worry, you're all. The medics are coming. They'll be here very shortly. We'll get you away and get you whatever. The burns were very unpleasant burns.
I'm sure.
I think he had a fracture of a wrist and one or two very, what I'd call minor fractures. But what none of us had realized at that time was the inhalation of the toxic fumes from principally of the resins in the bodywork, as well as maybe some of the bodywork panels. And this had gotten into his respiratory system, into his lungs. And that was the thing that actually really put his life at great risk. Yeah. And the story is very, he said a priest wanted to give him the last rites, and he told him where to go in no uncertain terms. Yes. And that was typical of Nicky, because I think he realized that if he had allowed himself to slip, then that would be it, he would go. So he fought it, and he sat, and his determination, in spite of probably being in extreme pain with the burns and having other issues he's having. So what he did, and particularly when he was released from hospital and his recovery, and to turn up at Monza 6 weeks later. I mean, I've said it's been written, and other people have now plagiarized it and said it was the most courageous act of any sportsman I've ever seen in my life, anytime, anywhere. Because he turned up and his head was swathed in bandages. Now, part of what helped his recovery was an unbelievable man called Willy Dungal. And Willy had been a ski trainer for the Austrian slalom team, or downhill ski team, and had been working with Nicky. Nicky wasn't a big fan of doing physical exercise, but he knew he had to do something. Willy took over and looked after him. One of the things Willy did, and he said this to me, and it's not public knowledge, but he was obviously aware that when Nicky got back into a car, would he freeze with the thought of all the things? So apparently, so he says, through one of these training sessions, Willy got a bowl of newspaper, lit it, Nicky threw it at him to see how Nicky would respond.
Wow.
No problem.
And he was fine.
At that point, Willy knew he would be able to get into the car. I know when he drove the car at Monza initially, he had to get accustomed to all the emotions and feelings of getting back into a Formula One car.
Sure.
And driving it. But I mean, once he went through that initial first practice session, he was back at the races. He put it all behind him. He looked, I mean, honestly, it was, I felt sorry for his wife, Marlena, because she had been through to hell in a handcart and back.
Yeah.
And I mean, honestly, the courage that he displayed that weekend, I've never seen the equal of that. Maybe other people will say, well, somebody else has done something courageous as well. But in my experience, I've never ever seen a man with more courage than Niki Lauda had when he stepped into this car at Monza 1976.
That's incredible to hear it firsthand. I mean, that is. I mean, I remember 3 or 4 years ago, was it Tiger Woods won the Golf Masters, having had surgeries and God knows what. And they said, "Oh, this is the greatest comeback in the history of sport." I went, "No, I think Niki Lauda might have something to say about that."
I think I would agree with you on that. I mean,
Yeah,
I don't want to demean what Tiger has done.
it's
He's
incredible.
been, a phenomenal performer and sportsman, but Niki did, because the difference is, if you're a sportsman in a sport where there is no actual, let's call it, physical danger, and golf, it's unlikely you're going to crash 140 miles an hour into a side of a cliff face and have the car disintegrate and catch fire. I mean, I don't think that's going to happen on a golf course, personally. But I know I'm open to it. Could happen.
But the game is changing.
One day,
so who knows?
you never know. You never know. It might happen.
Yeah, see if Live Golf have their way. We'll see. That's a different discussion. But incredible. No, thank you for talking about it. I appreciate it. It's amazing. 1977. You've moved to Brabham. Obviously, was it at the end of that year? Did Roger then say, right, that's it for F1 with Penske? Did he just want to step away, and that's how it came
Again,
about?
I mean, it's not a simple yes or no.
Yeah.
Back end of 77, the view that was in the team, that the team was going to expand into a two-car team. And I mean, one name that had been mentioned was Ronnie Peterson joining the team.
Right.
It never materialized, obviously. But at this time, Roger was in a period of commercial growth with his businesses and the expansion of his businesses. The fact that he was racing in NASCAR, racing in IndyCar, one guy can only do so much. And he, again, I use this one word, pragmatic. He had to make it probably one of the toughest calls in his sporting life, let alone his commercial life, in which he realized that by going to a two-car team, suddenly everything was going to ramp up. Costs were going to ramp up. Budgets were going to go up. Staff numbers are going to go up. Everything was going to go up. And one might suggest, this is only my view, was there going to be ultimately a benefit to his business, his companies, to ramping it up and also to some degree, possibly, the direction that Formula One was beginning to go in, it was changing. And it just became a decision that he had to make. I mean, I got the phone call. It was probably about 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. And I don't know, it was probably 9 o'clock at night when Roger rang. And I mean, it was probably the worst phone call I think Roger's, or one of the worst ones maybe he's ever had to make, to say, look, John, I've made a decision and I'm going to withdraw. And I'm very sorry. I know it's late in the year and the opportunities are not available, but I've given this thought, consideration, whatever, and it's basically either I stop now or whatever. And that was it. And it was as blunt as that. And the following morning, I rang up Heinz and said, "What the?" The Heinz was as basically as shocked as I was. Anyway, Heinz said, "Look, come down here, come down to the workshops, and we'll get on the phone and see what we can find, what seats are available." And essentially, there were only 2 unfilled seats. One was with Brabham to be teammate to Carlos Pache, and the other was it probably would have been at that time Shadow, before they sort of became Iros or whatever you want to call them.
Yeah.
And so we sat in Heinz's office, and first person we rang was Bernie. And Heinz said, "Bernie, just first of all, I want to tell you that Roger's pulling out of Formula One." Bernie didn't believe him. No, you don't say that. You're only pulling him out. Bernie, Roger's out. That's it. Okay, done. But now, my concern, I want to get John the best possible drive that's remaining, and yours is the best possible drive. And Bernie said, yeah. I'd love to do that, but I've got a problem. Martini Rossi, who were the team sponsors at the time, were anxious, keen to place Clay Regazzoni into the second car beside Carlos Pace.
Right.
Bernie was never very keen on sponsors having that level of input or control.
Right.
So Bernie said, okay, listen, John, you get up here and my manager, come to me at my apartment in London and we'll sit down and have a talk. So Nick and I went to Bernie's apartment, and it really took about 10 minutes because there wasn't much negotiation. It's what one might call a one-sided agreement. I wanted the drive and he got a very good deal out of it. But I got a good deal also. But Bernie had a problem, and the problem was Clay. They couldn't contact Clay at that time of night.
Right.
So Bernie got on the phone to Herbie Blash. Herbie, go to Heathrow. When you meet Clay, apologize and say Bernie's really sorry that you had to go to all this trouble, but he signed John for next year. I mean, Clay got there, and Clay went, "C'est la vie," or whatever you say in Italian. I mean, look, wow. This is what happens on occasion. Look, at the end of the day, I lost my drive at McLaren at the end of '83, largely because Alain Prost was fired by Renault, and he quickly contacted Philip Morris, who are McLaren sponsors and also sponsoring Ferrari. He said, "Can you get me a seat at Ferrari?" And he said, "No, the Ferrari seats are blocked, but we've got a seat at McLaren." And I went, "Well, hold on, you got Nicky and John. Nicky's under contract, John's out of contract. We would like to speak to you." So, right. What goes around comes around. And I mean, it worked for me in '77 and it worked against me in '84.
Yeah, sure. Wow, amazing. I didn't realize that it was when he landed, he was told that.
Yeah, Herbie was there, right. Met him. Clay came out, Clay was a wonderful character and, a very charismatic man, and turned around, went back to wherever he'd come from.
He just went and did his own thing.
Yeah.
The start of the season, though, '77. I mean, you were in the BT 45? Was it 45?
45, and then the 45B.
Yeah.
The B was just a slightly revised version of the 45.
Yeah, slightly tweaked version.
Yeah.
You had a couple of retirements at the start of the year, but it looked like the car was pretty decent, I guess, from what I can gather. But then obviously there was the tragic loss of Carlos. Well, before that we'd lost Tom Price as well, and in the space of, I guess, a fortnight.
Yeah.
That must have been again. I mean, you said it was almost the dangers were accepted at the time, but it was tragic to have lost two drivers within a fortnight, one on track and one off it.
Yes,
the circumstances
absolutely.
With Tom and the Marshal and all of that, and then obviously to lose your teammate in a light aircraft accident, it must have been very difficult for everyone at the time.
I mean, South Africa was a totally you couldn't make it up.
It was a freak thing.
And this incident happened during the course of the Grand Prix. I was on a different part of the racetrack to the point where the accident occurred, and obviously I was aware that there'd been a shunt down at Crowthorne, the corner at the end of the straight, and I know that Jacques Lafitte's car was involved, and he got
collected, didn't he?
Yeah, he got collected by Tom's car. I didn't know I didn't know the other car involved. It was only when the race finished then I was made aware that Tom had died.
Yeah.
It was hard to take it on board because I hadn't seen it, and I only saw two cars or whatever there were in the catch fencing at Crowthorne. I mean, Tom was a lovely, lovely person. I mean, a very nice, very self-effacing, shy man, and great race driver. Loved driving for the Shadow team, and very close to Alan Rees, and Debbie's Alan's wife. Needed a family environment and sort of thrived in that. Had a particular style of driving. He liked to get the back end out a bit, which was very effective in some situations. Maybe sometimes a bit hard on the rear tire, but that accident, I don't know. It was just tragedy across for every level. And then with Carlos was a different situation. He was flying. He'd been up country in Brazil and was flying back with a colleague. I think they got into an electric storm or something, and tragically the plane went down, and Carlos and I think the other passenger pilot lost their lives. But the news came through on the weekend of the Race of Champions at Brands Hatch,
Right.
and I'd secured pole position on the Saturday for that race, and I think the news broke on Saturday night or Sunday morning, whenever. Got to Brands Hatch, and I was told that Carlos had died.
Jeez.
Bernie was very, very receptive. Bernie liked Carlos a great deal. They were mates, and they would go out for dinner with their wives, and they'd have laughs. And I mean, something which you don't see a lot of probably in contemporary Formula One. And Carlos was a really lovely guy. Some people are lovely guys and some aren't. He was one of the lovely ones, and he was loved by the team. He was a great race driver as well. He won this 75 Brazilian Grand Prix at Interlagos. Very important for Carlos to win the Brazil Grand Prix. And then, it left a bad, not a bad atmosphere. It left a dark cloud, if you like,
Sure.
over the team, over the rest of the weekend, Sunday and whatever. So, I mean, Bernie had to suddenly react, and what do we do? And I think Larry Perkins came in momentarily, and then Handstuck then got the seat effectively for the rest of these. Handstuck is hands, knees, bumps a daisy. Stritzelstuck.
Lovely. Yeah. Real character. I mean, obviously these things happen. And he came in, but I mean, again, just looking over the results, I'm not sure if the results were indicative of what the car was like, but there was a lot of retirements that year as well for you, and it just seemed to be one of those years that never really got going, just from the outside looking in. But you returned to the team in '78. The BT46 was a completely different beast, wasn't it? It was a completely, well, it kind of seemed to be. Was that a better car?
Well, let me go back to '77. The BT45 and B was a quick car.
Yeah.
I had pole position Monaco in '77. That's a prize for pole position Monaco.
Oh, wow!
Don't tell anybody. And
very nice.
There were a number of races where the car. Dijon '77. Halfway around the final lap, the thing fuel surge. Just, next race, British Grand Prix, leading the race, another fuel issue. So 2 Grand Prix that had my name written over them didn't materialize, and there were maybe 1 or 2 others that I could have had certainly very strong results in. So the results don't reflect the car's performance. And I mean, the way that the car had been described in the press, certainly in Dijon, when Mario was chasing and he was quicker around bits of the circuit, I was quicker on other bits. They called me Goliath and Mario was David. So it was one of these, it was like David chasing whatever, the giant. It was a great race. And I mean, I'd done a good job and done all I needed to do to win the race. And far end of the circuit at Dijon, just up the hill, and Mario on it like a rash, didn't need to be asked twice. And he won the race. And James in '77 at Silverstone, we had on the front row of the grid, I got the jump, led the race, and James was pursuing. And he generously said, after how would I call him? Highly regarded Formula One correspondent said to him, "Oh, well, you would have beaten John, wouldn't you?" And James said, and I respect him for this, said, "No. That was John's Grand Prix. He was going to win it."
Wow.
That shows you how much sometimes people understand Formula One.
Wow. Yeah. Someone just assumed that James was going to do it.
Anyway, but James was honest, and he said, "Look, on the day, I was over him like a rash on certain parts of the circuit, but other bits, the balance seesawed around the lap." But I knew that with my car, that the further into the race we went, and the Brabham had to run quite a lot more fuel because it used more fuel. As the weight came down, then the car's competitiveness would increase. But unfortunately, we didn't get to that stage. So in '78, Nicky joined the team. And not only did Nicky join the team, but he brought the title sponsor, which was now Parmalat. And Parmalat was a personal sponsor of Nicky. So in, again, my naivety, and I'd said, when Bernie had mentioned this, I said, look, all I ask, Bernie, I don't mind who you bring in as a teammate. I just ask that you guarantee that we'll both receive equal preparation, whatever you want to call them. Yeah, no problem. But Nicky is a very clever operator, and he knew the power that he possessed, and he knew how to exercise that power. And also, Bernie liked the guy a bunch. I love Nicky. He was the teammate of all teammates. I enjoyed being a teammate of, even though he was trying to do this and do. But I liked him a lot as a person. But he used every trick that he knew to guarantee his position would be the preeminent position within the team. And Bernie, because he knew that the money that Parmalat brought and the power that Nicky had just won a second world championship. So it was a difficult season and a disappointing season because maybe more could have been achieved. But with the BT46, what you may not be aware, when Gordon Murray designed the car, it was going to be one of the most revolutionary designs in Formula One history because he designed the triangular shape of the monocoque. The outer skin was going to have a radiator system cooling known as surface cooling. So there was no conventional radiator on the car at all. There were just surface cooling panels bedded in or embedded into the side of the monocoque. It's something, surface cooling is not new. It's been used in aircraft and used, I think even some tanks may have surface cooling. The benefit of it, had it worked, would have been unbelievable.
Wow.
I drove the car and we went down to Alfa Romeo's test track at Bolocco. And a lap around the Bolocco test track is about 4.5 kilometers. From stone cold to coming back to the pits, it was boiling its head off. The concept may have worked theoretically, but it didn't work practically. And we did tests at Silverstone. And then at one point, I did a back-to-back test at Silverstone. The car with the surface cooling radiator set up on, and then the car with a conventional, a jury-rigged dual front radiator. When you put the front radiators on, it was like you put your hand up in the wind. The car felt like 100 horsepower slower with the conventional, because conventional radiators are extremely draggy.
Right.
I mean, talk to Adrian Newey about radiator drag, and he could talk to you for days about it, because if you can mitigate or reduce the drag through a conventional radiator, you're going to generate horsepower. So Gordon had to turn around and do an unbelievable job in re-engineering the car from having surface cooling, get rid of that, and redesign the front of the car with conventional radiators with a totally different front aerodynamic nose package. And it meant we went to the first two Grand Prix, Argentina and Brazil, with BT45C. Just trying to cancel that. BT45C, which was the 45 with a revised nose on it and whatever. And then South Africa was the first time that the BT46 turned up with this revised nose. But even in that configuration, it just understeered everywhere. So Gordon had to do another cut and shut. And quite simply, all he did was, it was the principle of the lever. He just extended the front from the front bulkhead, took everything forward by about a foot or more. So the principle of the lever enabled the front to do what it should have done in the first place.
Right.
So we got balance in the car, and that was essentially the car that we raced all the way through the '78 season, with the exception of Sweden.
So, just 1 second. My phone's been going ballistic. I just want to check it's nothing too serious. Sorry about this. Sorry. I'm back again. I was very aware of my phone going ballistic in the background. Sorry about that. But yes, I just love Gordon Murray sort of brain child. Hang on just 1 second. No, okay, it wasn't anything.
Anyway, the thing was Gordon. Gordon is a very lateral thinking engineer designer, and I mean, one of the things that I miss in current Formula One, there isn't any place today for that level of innovation. I mean, Chapman effectively introduced ground effects. Gordon introduced the fan car. Everybody's race car was an individual looking design and a visual individual looking car. If you paint every single Formula One car today on the grid, based white,
they're all at the same.
Without examining it up close, you'd be difficult to tell which is which.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that's been lost, because regulations are now such that there's little or no room for that degree of innovation that I've enjoyed through my career.
Yeah, sure. It sort of, I don't know, it sort of gives you a narrower scope, doesn't it? I mean, you can't really play around with too much these days. I mean, obviously we mentioned about the race in Sweden, the fan car, which everyone, I think it's come up in the comments a few times. I remember, what was it, Mario Andretti was kicking off saying it's going to kick stones up and everything, and Colin Chapman was the same, and all the others. And I mean, how much difference did it make to drive that car with the fan and obviously the principles of the airflow and everything?
Well, the concept of the fan car was the fan. The idea was to extract the low pressure under the car. Yeah. And the reason the fan worked so successfully, because it was geared via the gearbox to engine speed. So at 12,000 RPM in first gear, the fan was working at the same efficiency as 12,000 in sixth gear. And on top of which, as you went higher up the speed range, then it had gone back to a conventional front nose and rear wing. So then they would come into play as well. And I think the difference in the style of driving the fan car over the conventional car would have been more about entry into a corner. So the key was, when you entered the corner, was to maybe not scratch and scrabble into the corner, but to maybe be a little bit earlier on everything you were doing, to ensure that once you got back on the throttle, you then got the fan functioning and then sucking the car down to ensure that you got more and more and more and more grip as you went through the corner, and then your exit speed of the corner was going to be quicker. Whereas a ground effect car, the principles of ground effect are about the square of the speed. So you need airspeed to affect more and more downforce. So the Lotus 79 had very good aerodynamic properties. The Brabham had better aerodynamic properties, and a circuit like Sweden, Anderstorp, was almost purpose made for a fan car, because there were relatively second, third gear corners, long parabolic corners. And if you did it correctly, then that's where the car was at its most effective and most efficient. But I mean, I remember Mario and Colin Chapman. I can do my Mario impersonation. Hey man, that car's chucking out rocks. It's gonna kill somebody. And Chapman was jumping up and down like a Duracell bunny, going nuts. So I'm gonna pull out. I'm gonna withdraw. We're gonna ban this dude. I mean, Ken Turrell was standing on the table in the meeting, frothing at the mouth. It was out of control. Bernie went, hold on a second, hold on. Look, I'm here. I've got the car. Can't do anything about it. Can't change the car. Let me race. And I give you my word, hands on heart, I will not race the fan car again. And that was the agreement that was reached in Anderstorp. Wow. Bernie won the race. Nicky won the race. I should have been on the podium, but a passing Patrizia screwed it up and went off and whatever. But the fan car won its one and only event.
Yes, Nicky. Yeah.
Bernie had to bite the bullet, but there was a certain amount of, you might say, bittersweetness at the following Grand Prix, because that was the French Grand Prix at Paul Ricard. And it gave me enormous pleasure to be on pole position in the bog standard BT 46 and go up to Mario and Colin and say, up you, mate.
yeah. Fan didn't make that.
In fairness, Mario won the race.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just a nice little point to make to them. So, well, there you go. Oh dear, fantastic. Just, excuse me. I mean, just thinking out loud, and obviously obviously Bernie was getting more of a standing in F1 at the time as well, not just with the Brabham, and he was looking at, you know, eyes elsewhere perhaps. And do you think withdrawing the fan car was perhaps one of the rare times that he might have put the sport ahead of himself? Because obviously Bernie's known for being quite ruthless and very in it for himself from the outside looking in. But do you think he thought, well, you know, this isn't good for Formula One, and I'd like a slice of the pie a bit further up the ladder?
I think Bernie looked at it. I can use this word pragmatic, although I use it quite a lot. In fact, Bernie realised that there's enormous potential for Formula One, the growth of Formula One, essentially through television. And he also recognised at that moment up in Sweden that there was a potential danger for the sort of the cabal of Formula One teams. This could have splintered it. It could have actually fractured it irrevocably. And he took the view that there's a bigger pie out there to be won than there is to bang the table and say, I'm not going to give it up. You can do whatever you like. I'm going to continue race. So Bernie, he is a commercial operator. And his vision was maybe moving at that point, the beginning, if you like, of a move away from being a team owner, team principal, to becoming the owner or the operator of Formula One. And it took a further number of years before that situation was actually fully sort of signed off. Right. But Bernie was aware that also there was nobody in Formula One who wanted to do Bernie's job. Colin Chapman was clever enough to do most of what Bernie was doing, but Chapman didn't want to do it. And Bernie also recognized, again, Ferrari. He admired Enzo Ferrari a great deal, and he realized that it's important. Ferrari is a foundation member of Formula One, and we have to keep them on board. So he was looking at it as a longer term project, and the first step was to try and grow the harmony of Formula One, keep the teams together, and then be able to present a package, a program to television networks and make it attractive to a television network to come along and pay a sanction fee or whatever you want to call it, a fee to take the broadcast. So it was from that period, and his unselfishness by doing what he did, and make no mistake, that was not a cheap exercise that he funded. And he got one race, he got the result. But all the kit of parts, I think all the kit of parts still probably is down at Biggin Hill, which Bernie happens to own. And I think there is a fan car per se in existence. But he just said, look, there's bigger things here, which I want to be in on the ground floor on. And as it happens, that's what he did. And he became phenomenally successful and the operator of Formula One.
Wow, it's amazing. Sorry, we just got a little special guest. Do you want to come and say hello? So I just want to say hello. This is my daughter, Lucy. She's just come home.
Hello, Lucy.
She's just come here to say hello. Hello, everyone.
Hi.
Right then. Do you want to come and see you later? Okay. Sorry about that.
No. You're a daddy. You're a daddy.
She's just popped home. She wants to come and say hello. That's my daughter. But no, obviously, it's amazing the way that Bernie's route up through the echelons of F1 has taken him. Obviously, once you'd left Brabham, though, I'm just where is the time? Once you'd left Brabham, you decided to make the switch to go to McLaren. How did that come about? The departure from Brabham, joining McLaren, and everything that was going on there.
I mean, it's very simple. It came out of the tragic loss of Ronnie Peterson.
Yeah,
Monza '78. There was an appalling start line accident that ultimately would claim Ronnie's life, and it was one of the worst start line accidents I think Formula One has ever seen. Because it happened behind me, and the first 6-7 cars on that lap were unaware of what had happened until we came back onto the start finish straight, and all of a sudden it's like an airplane accident. I mean, I've never seen anything in a racetrack like it. So when the race finished, and I was changing in the Brabham area, and an emissary from McLaren came and said, "Look, John, could you come up and speak to us up at the Marlborough McLaren hospitality. Okay, joined up. And it was pretty blunt. I said, look, Ron is seriously injured. He is signed with us to drive in 79, I think, and 80. And clearly, it's a severe accident, and we need to consider other circumstances, other options, in the event that Ronnie is unable to. So I said, yes, I'm happy to talk to you, because I maybe at the end of 78, there was a sense that I wasn't going to be at Brabham in 79. Nothing had been said, but I just got a feeling maybe my time and whatever.
Yeah.
So
it'll perhaps run its course.
Yeah. On Monday morning, I'd stayed overnight in Milan, and then flew to meet somebody who I was going to see, and I was given the news that Ronnie had died, and it was one of the worst moments of my life, because Ronnie was one of the most popular people in Formula One paddock. He was a friend, and just beyond sad, honestly, beyond sad, because one can say that had he been given certain treatments earlier, he would have survived.
Yes,
his leg injuries were severe. There's no doubt about it, but he would have survived.
Yeah.
So that opened up negotiations with McLaren for the seat in 79. And McLaren they were going to make their first ground effect Formula One car, the M28, which unfortunately was not a good car.
Yes, I remember you saying it wasn't great.
No, there's things I could tell you, and I'll defer on those things. So it was a difficult start to the 79 season, and then for the British Grand Prix, the team had seen what was going on around them, and Ligier had done a great job with their car. Williams had then brought out their chassis, and I think McLaren had looked at what they were doing and sort of made a facsimile of it, and it was clearly a much better car, and also the structural integrity of the car was better, and it was lighter, which was the other thing. The M28, with all the extra strengthening that had been built into it, became heavy. So the M29 put us back probably somewhere at the front of the middle of the grid, if it were, because the lead two teams were certainly Ligier and Williams, and 79. Then likewise Brabham with the BT49. That was a great car. I mean, a typical Gordon Murray, fantastic car. So we were sort of the front of the middle of the grid, and I suppose that's roughly where we stayed until the end of the season.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it obviously, as you touched on, it was kind of a transitional time, for F1 in general, with ground effects and all the other, all the other changes. I mean, I guess it was sort of hard to gauge anything on that first season. But was it after? And obviously, you were a teammate to Patrick Tambay, who was very sad he lost last year. Very, very, very sad to have lost him. But the M28 was the following car, wasn't it? That was in development. I mean, was
hold on. M28 was the first McLaren ground effect car. It was then superseded by the M29, which is the car that was the race car for the second half of 79, and then was the 29B, I think it was, for 1980. And again, there had been regulation changes regarding wings and certain other aerodynamic qualities.
Okay. I mean,
so in 1980, that was the year when Alain Prost joined the team.
Yes.
And Alain Prost, McLaren Patrick Tambay had been a part of the team in 78 and 79. And the team then, and maybe in conjunction with Philip Morris, felt that they wanted to have a look at some other talent that was around. There were two options that went for a test at Paul Ricard. One was Kevin Coogan, who was essentially the McLaren choice, and the other was Alain Prost, who was the Marlboro choice.
Right.
And both drivers, we went down to Paul Ricard. I drove the car initially, and then handed it over to Kevin, then on to Alain. But it was pretty obvious from literally almost leaving the pit lane that Alain was going to be an exceptional talent. And he was then offered the drive, and he accepted it. And Alain joined the team. And from, literally out of the box, he was outstanding. I mean, in his first year, terrific. And what Alan was particularly good at was that sort of the minutiae of springs, roll bars, dampers. The problem that the McLaren, I felt, my view was at the time, was that, yes, when I accept that Alan's getting more out of the car than I'm doing by, a minute change here, whatever. I said the core problem is an aerodynamic problem. But because Alan was doing such a good job, all of a sudden the team then put most of the focus and emphasis on Alan, and I then was sort of finding myself being, not deliberately, but sort of as a consequence of being shuffled back.
Sure.
And that was a tough year for me because it just was a tough year. McLaren then introduced at the back end of 1980 another model called the M30.
Okay.
So you may haven't heard of the M30 it superseded the M29 and 29B. So this was meant to be, if you like, McLaren's definitive ground effect car. And that car rocked up, I think, at the Dutch Grand Prix. Now, through 1980, McLaren had made upgrades to M29, which Alan got first. The significant upgrade, which I didn't get until the Dutch Grand Prix, was the full carbon fiber underfloor. And the benefit of the full carbon fiber underfloor was that instead of having section changes in the tunnels, 90-degree section changes, which air doesn't like. Air likes nice, gentle curves.
Yeah.
So the carbon fiber underbody had proper curves. So it was a much, much better underbody, and it was lighter probably also. So I got that at Zandvoort, and Alan had the M30. And the M30 turned into be a bit of a recalcitrant child. And I started to perform more appropriate to what I felt my ability was. Right. So there, Imola, and then a big leap forward came in Canada and Watkins Glen, because aside from what was going on within the technical side of McLaren, there was now the spectre of Ron Dennis and John Barnard being co-owners of the McLaren team. McLaren had fought against that at the end of 79 and had managed to win that argument, but they weren't going to win it at the end of 1980. So anyway, at Canada, John Barnard was then looking after my car, which is the M29B, and Teddy Mayer and whoever looking after Alan on the M30. And John Barnard looked at the car and he told the engineers, the mechanics, do this. What are you doing? And one of the things was he was lifting the front right hand. No, it'll take off. Don't. He said, just go out and try it and tell me. Go out, drive it, come in, tell me what it's doing. Within about 5 corners, unbelievable. The change was night and day.
Wow. And
Alan's still struggling with the M30 on little dampers, roll bars, springs. Forget it. It's in the aerodynamics. So basically, McLaren had been running the car nose down, close to the ground, and it was precluding airflow getting under the nose to enable the tunnels to work. It was basic stuff, but it was only John Barnard that said, do it. So I've greatly improved M29 in Canada, and I greatly improved M29 in Watkins Glen. And in Watkins Glen, I think it was one of the practice sessions, Alan in the M30 had a failure and went off, hit the barriers quite hard. And the poor little fellow got a bit of a rattling around and shooting up and whatever. The session stopped. I said, where's Alan? Oh, he's still in the medical center. All right. So I went down to see him. And there's this little thing, size of a baby, lying on a gurney. He said, John, I'm telling you now, you'll be #1 driver at McLaren next year, because he was being pursued by Renault through basically quite early into the 1980 season to sign for Renault to be one of their 2 drivers. And at that stage, Alan then decided, that's it. I'm not driving for McLaren again. I'm going to go to Renault. I'm going to be, whether it's #1 or whatever it was at the time. Wow. And so I thought, well, I have to wait for McLaren to come and say, I'm going to drive for them in 1981. But because of Alan's actions, he just, forget it, I'm out. I'm not going to drive for them again.
Wow.
History. But he did. He ended up going back in 84.
Yeah.
But it was the poor little guy was lying there, and he'd been beaten and shaken up, and he was bruised and sore. But I don't know if I think I was the only person from the team at that point who'd gone down to see him.
Oh, right. No one else had gone down.
And also, let me just also say, in South Africa in 1980, in practice, he had spun at the S's in Kyalami, and the steering wheel had whiplashed him, and it hurt his wrist. So, he's back in the, oh, my wrist. Man up, Alan, man up. Give over.
Get on with it.
So on Saturday night, in the hotel, I'm just about to go to bed, about 10 o'clock. That's me knocking on my table. It was Marie-Claude Beaumont, a very well-known French journalist. She was a racing driver as well and photographer. He said, what's wrong? John, Alan's in really, this is bad. It's really painful. Would you take him to hospital? What do you mean? Where's Teddy? Where's the team? We can't find anybody. You're the only person. Would you take him to the hospital? So, all right, Alan, get in the car. I don't know where the hospital we went to, but we found a hospital, took him in, explained to the doctors what had happened. So they x-rayed him, said, Mr. Prost, you've fractured your scaphoid in your left wrist or your right wrist, whichever. Scaphoid is one that's a tiny, but it's a bone maybe smaller on your fingernail, little fingernail, but it's the one that's got the least amount of blood circulation, and it takes a long time to recover. Right. So I said, oh, it's going to be a month, 6 weeks before you can drive again at the earliest. So I said, right, Alan, let's go back to the hotel. And eventually I got hold of Teddy. I said, Teddy, I've just been to the hospital with Alan. He's got a fractured scaphoid, and he isn't going to be able to drive for another month to 6 weeks at the earliest. And Teddy couldn't believe it. He's always taking the piss. So he was my little baby brother in a funny way. I looked after him like you look after your little baby brother.
Wow.
And so did that. And then at Watkins Glen, went to see him again when he's lying there in the gurney. Anyway.
Whimpering away.
No, he wasn't. But it was a nasty shunt. It got a big old bang. And, I can laugh about it because I've had a few bangs also. So I can laugh about it, and I've been first person. So I know what he was feeling like. And you're sitting there on your own. There's nobody to come to talk to you. At least I went down and saw the guy. Yeah. And he then said, look, I'm telling you now,
he just
I'm not going to be there next year. It's your seat. You have it.
Wow. I had no idea that. I knew that he'd left and he wasn't, particularly happy with things. I didn't realise that was how it went.
Yep.
No, thank you. That's very cool. Well, not for Alan, but obviously, but you know what I mean. Just sort of going. Again, you said he was going to be out for 81. The MP4 came in 81. Just while we're on the subject, you said you had a few bangs. I remember there was one you've probably spoken about a few times, a crash that looked pretty spectacular that you had in 81 at Monza. It was that one, the car kind of broke in half and there was flame everywhere, and like Murray Walker was on the rev limiter.
Oh no, I know. It looked serious at the moment. It looked serious.
But you got out and you were okay. Was it just one of those where the back stepped out and went round and that was it?
Well, no, the back didn't step out per se. I was following two other cars, and I was essentially what I was doing. I was looking beyond where I was in the racetrack to line up to get past one of them going up into the Ascari chicane.
Sure.
And I got too close at that point, and the front of the car washed out. And I should have lifted on the throttle to check the car, but I thought, sod it, I'm going to stick it. I'm going to stick with it because I don't want to lose my momentum. And at the time, they had these kind of sausage curbs on the outside of Lesmo too. And the car rode the curb, but then it dropped the outside wheels on the outside of the curb. And then the bottom of the car did that on the curbing, and it then started to rotate. And that's where the spin, and then it was doing about 130, 40 mile an hour. And then it just began to rotate, and it spun across the track and went backwards into the barrier. And the gearbox got wedged against the barrier and one of the mounting posts. And the levered the gearbox away from the engine, and then the engine came away from the chassis. So the gearbox was left in the Armco barrier, and the engine slid across the racetrack. Now,
Wow.
this is all happening in fractions of seconds. So
Yeah.
I knew I was going to hit the barriers, put my head down, went bang, still alive. Had a look, and there's an engine, a DFE, sliding across the racetrack. Thought, whose engine is that? I didn't realize it was my engine. And it clipped the back of Alboretto's Tyrrell, who tried to get him up. Anyway, he spun up the track and had his own little moment. So I got out of the car, had a look. Oh, Jesus wept. Where's my engine? That's my engine over there. That's my gearbox in the barrier. The gear lever and the linkage had all gone out the back. I was unhurt.
Wow.
I didn't know anything about the sort of the momentary sort of cloud and flame and all that. What that was just simply fuel and oil vapor. Just a puff. I went up.
Yeah.
I was unhurt. Walked back. I got the lift back to the pits. Nothing. Wow. Didn't feel a thing.
Amazing.
So apologise to the team. The car's damaged. But it's a bit bad. Sorry, guys. That's what happened.
It looks like one of those fairly innocuous ones, and then the car's in half, and you think, crikey, what's happened? You must have thought, how did that happen?
Well, I didn't know any of that in the process, because I'd put my head down and closed my eyes. Only when I got out of the car and I saw the engine going one way, and my car up against the barrier without an engine and a gearbox stuck against the barrier support.
Thinking, crikey, that was
anyway.
Spectacular.
There's no point, Richard. There's no point dwelling on what might have happened or what could have happened. You have to just take a point of view. I'm standing here, 100%, nothing wrong with me. Get back to the pits, apologise to the team, headed back wherever I was going after the Grand Prix. A few days later, I went up to Donington Park because my good old mate Nicky, having had his airline get into difficulties, decided he's going to make a comeback. And he wanted to drive for Marlboro McLaren. It was the only option that was really going to be available. So I turned up at Donington, jumped into the car they had there, did the single fastest lap I'd ever done in Donington, 3 days or whatever it was after the accident. Gave it to Nicky, and then he went out and drove the car for an hour or half an hour, but he was puffing and wheezing like some old geezer because he wasn't very fit at that time. Yeah, so he had to go, he said, had to decide if he wanted to do it, or he could do it, or what was involved in it. So essentially what he did was he went away, thought about it. Yeah. But McLaren were probably a little bit hedging their bets. So initially what he got was a 3-race contract with the proposition that if he wanted to do it, they'd agreed a contract in principle, but there was a sort of a, what do you call it, a 3-race break point if one or both parties decided to go different ways. Okay. And the rest, well, we all know about. He won the 3rd Grand Prix, I think it was, in Long Beach.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, I'm actually reading reading Nicky's book at the moment, and there's that bit you've just described of getting back in. Could he still do it? Do he still want to? That's where I am in the book. So
yeah. I mean, only the car understeers too much, and the steering's too heavy. So we had a standard size steering wheel at that time. So we I can't drive, it's too heavy. So against all John Barnard's inclinations, we had to fit a slightly bigger steering wheel to give him more purchase, more leverage. Right. So both of us ended up having the same steering wheel in 82. But anyway, there we are. That's my mate Nicky.
Yeah, fantastic. Come to Nicky very quickly shortly. Just want to backtrack again to 81. We've got to talk about the British Grand Prix. I watched the highlights of it one evening this week. I read somewhere that because you had the Cosworth engine in the car, and you didn't think, you'd gone well. You had a couple of good results, but you didn't think Silverstone was particularly suited to the Cosworth engine. It was the least likely race that you were going to do well at, and it all kind of, I won't say fell your way, because you passed a number of cars on that race and everything. What was that like, that whole weekend? Obviously, it's your home Grand Prix.
Okay, there's a sort of a backstory as with everything with me. There's always a backstory. So the MP411 had been introduced and it had a slightly difficult start because of very minor issues, but eventually got the car running. And the Spanish Grand Prix in Jarama, just outside Madrid, was, I think, one of the closest finishes in the history of Formula One. Five cars covered by about a second and a half. I finished third. So Villeneuve did a brilliant job in the Ferrari. Lafitte couldn't find a way around him, and I was trying to find a way around Lafitte to see if I could have a go at Villeneuve. Second, in French Grand Prix at Dijon, where the car, again, it was a great circuit for the car. Alain won that race. I was second, and Piquet was third. Come to the British Grand Prix. So the media, more maybe the Fleet Street, said, John, you're going to win the British Grand Prix. And I said, well, who was that comedian who used to go 3, 2, 1, whatever, I forget the name of the comedian.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's possible, it's possible. The reality was that the pace that Renault had, and to a lesser degree Ferrari, but certainly the Renault had, it was a good chassis, a good engine, and they ought to have been able to win that race, but for reliability. And the Ferrari was, the 81 Ferrari had a great engine, wasn't a great aerodynamic car. Ted Rogers, somebody just popped the name up on the sidebar. Ted Rogers.
Thank you, Oliver Taylor. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So anyway, but Gilles, in his usual manner, would drive the wheels off it. Sometimes literally drive the wheels off it. And the race started, and the two Renaults kind of got away. I think Piquet might have been in that group, but then there's a group of cars which was headed by Gilles, and coming through the chicane at Goodwood, the chicane at Silverstone, he had the Ferrari oversteer, and it was bounce. But I said he was driving like a hyperactive child. Right. Now, you might say that's very uncomplimentary about Saint Gilles, but that's what I saw from the cockpit. And eventually, it just got out of control. And Alan Jones was very close behind him, and I was directly behind Alan, and my teammate Andrea was directly behind me. They're all being stacked up. Gilles lost control, just lost him in a cloud of blue smoke. Alan didn't know where he was, and he bumped into Gilles. Luckily, I was able to back out of it enough and get stopped enough to avoid those two. My little mate behind me, Andrea, who was doing what he shouldn't, he was doing this. He was driving on my gearbox. He should have been looking through the corner, looking to see where, looking to see where he's going. Andrea was young, and sometimes he found it hard to listen to good advice. And all of a sudden, I'm stopping, and he goes, sharp left, off into the catch fencing, out of the race. When the cloud, sort of this blue smoke dissipates, and I find myself sitting there, that I had to brake so heavily that actually the car had stalled. But I still had a small amount of momentum, so dipped the clutch, flicked on the electric fuel pump, got it going again. But I'd lost maybe 5 or 6 places because of all this. So I had to then go back and start catching and overtaking people who had already done so earlier in the opening laps. And then eventually, I think it was Alain retired. Piquet went off up at Beckett's for either a tire or a suspension issue. And then it was Arnoux. And eventually Arnoux' Renault began to lose power. So I ended up catching him and then finally overtaking him. And I went on and won the race. But in the closing laps, there was nobody to challenge me at that stage. So Ron Dennis realized that this was going to be the fulfillment of his lifetime's dreams and ambitions, and for John Barnard, and fulfillment for everybody at Marlborough who had put all this belief and funding in behind the operation. So Ron's on the pit wall going, slow down.
Pleading.
Yeah, so the way I slowed down was my way. And what I'd started to do is, instead of revving to normally 10.5 or 10.6, I reduced it to 10,000. Slow down. So the lap times aren't changing. So I've dropped it from 10,000 to 9.5. Slow down. Eventually I start changing gear at 9,000. I can't change it any lower. And then the checkered flag comes out. And the difference between revving to 10.5 or 10.6 and 9,000 was only about a couple of tenths or 3 tenths of a second a lap. Yeah. But I did it my way because my way meant that I wasn't losing what I feel is vital is the rhythm of your braking, your entry, whatever you do. So I maintained the rhythm of what I was doing. So I just reduced the revs and the power.
Because otherwise
slow down.
Because I guess otherwise you're driving the lap differently, and that's when things can go wrong.
That's exactly. You break your rhythm, then that's when errors can creep in. So,
yeah.
Look, I'd lost the French Grand Prix in 1977 on the final lap. I'd potentially lost British Grand Prix again in the Brabham. So I was aware that anything can happen between the point when I got ahead of Arnaud to the checkered flag, and I had to keep my focus on I'm doing my job, gear changing. Okay, you're slightly short shifting. Maybe I was lifting and coasting a little bit more, but the core rhythm I retained. It's not rocket science.
Yeah, I mean, and you know what the car's doing better than Mr. Dennis on the. Yeah, he can look at
but all they see is what's on
the mechanical side.
Yeah, they just know it's on a stopwatch. They don't understand. There was no telemetry as we have today. I mean, if we had the telemetry today back in '81, they would have seen what I was doing. They would have understood it. But they're standing in a pit wall. He's not slowing down. Tell him to slow down.
It's mechanically not that easy.
Sometimes, it makes you want to weep.
Yeah, I'm sure. But then, there's like the track invasion and all that, and it must have been fantastic.
To be the beneficiary of what occurred following that race, it lives. I mean, even today, I might go to an event, or sometimes one time in Gatwick car park at the airport, I got out of the car and there's another gentleman. And I said, "Oh, is this the way in?" Yeah. Hold on, I know you. I was at Silverstone that day when you won. So literally, it can happen. It could be in a supermarket. It could be in an airport. It could be anywhere. There are a lot of people there, and most of them are youngsters. I mean, there are teenagers probably, some even younger, and they just are very kind to come and say, "I just want to say what a great day it was, and thank you." I said, "Please, look, you're making my day by coming to me and thanking me for something which I was just doing my job." It's never stopped in the 42 years since '81. And I'm a very fortunate person to have enjoyed that degree of almost love from race fans.
What a lovely thing to have, obviously for you, and obviously for the people. If they bump into you, they can still reminisce over what was obviously a fantastic day. Brilliant. I'm just keeping an eye on the time. I mean, it's no problem, but
we've just been going for 3 hours. That's all.
It's been great. I love it.
We're only halfway through.
I'll be here all night.
Only halfway through.
Fantastic. But just obviously the following year, '82. I mean, there was a lot went on in '82. A lot of it not particularly good. I mean, I guess the first thing was South Africa, and it was all with the driver's strike and all the hoo-ha. And I mean, I spoke with Roberto Guerrero, who was due to make his debut on that race, and he was thinking, "What is happening here?" Because it was all about, was it the FIA and the licensing and all the?
It was all about the FIA were trying to introduce what you might call a football-style contract, which would really enable the teams to trade drivers rather than the drivers being masters of their own destiny, and it then triggered this strike. And all these things had been actually previewed prior to the season starting, but it reached a hiatus at the Grand Prix, and I mean the whole if you want to call it a strike was being, I think, led primarily by Didier Pironi.
Okay.
Nicky was involved because Nicky would naturally want to be involved, and Nicky had a lot of clout and a lot of influence, but Didier was the one that was the smart guy. And he was the one that did most of the negotiation with Balestra, and argued maybe with Bernie as well. So eventually, there was a sort of a compromise of sorts reached, which enabled us to go to the track and qualify and then hold the race. And it was a great shame because Kyalami was one of the races that everybody, in spite of being in South Africa and the politics of it, was one of the races that was a very popular event on the calendar.
Right. Wow. And because obviously at that time there was a lot happening in South Africa, and that's for another discussion. But obviously you guys were all locked in well, from what I can gather, like locked in a room, and I heard that obviously like Elio was on the piano, and I'm sure there was. Did I read somewhere else that somebody else was having a bash on the piano, and Nelson PK was barking around, and all kinds of things going on.
Elio was a trained classical pianist.
Yeah.
And could sit down. I mean, wonderful pianist. Gilles could play a Scott Joplin boogie rags.
That's it, Gilles. Yeah.
He was a one-trick pony with his piano, but he played it well. In fairness, he played it very well. PK's a dirty little you-know-what. And he was extremely, in my view, disrespectful to Carlos Reutemann, because Carlos is a fundamentally a very self-effacing and a shy man, and he didn't want to be there. He certainly didn't want to be in you might say, a dormitory of 20+ drivers. And Nelson, who decided to pick on Carlos, and come here, Carlitos, let me give you all this sort of, and Carlos is just embarrassed out of belief. And I'm not a Nelson fan. I don't get his humor, and I think he's very good at shooting bullets at people, and some of them have come back to bite him, and some of them have been fairly recently, and some of them have involved having to pay a significant amount of money. But he's a rich guy. I don't think he's going to worry about it too much. He might worry more about being banned from the paddock by the FIA.
Yes, after some recent things come to light. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I've never met Nelson. I've never, I've got no idea. But
you would remember if you'd met him.
Yes, I'm sure. I mean, from what I've heard, he's well. I mean, he can divide opinion.
Well, look, we're all sort of a bit like, what's the stuff you put in your toast?
Marmite.
Marmite. We're all a bit Marmite in our own ways. And the people in Brabham love Nelson. And I mean, one of the things Nelson sometimes did, I call him a dirty little you-know-what. But he was mischievous, and he had a sense of humor, which was very much his sense of humor. And on one occasion, he's sitting in the grid, and Charlie, come on, Charlie. I can feel water in the car. And apparently there's a few drips of water coming from underneath the car. And Charlie put his finger down and did this to see what it was. The dirty little sod had pissed in the car.
Oh, come on.
No.
Ugh. Come on. There's got to be a line.
He thought that was hilarious.
I can see how, the person on the receiving. Yeah, you don't.
We're all Marmite in our own little way.
Yeah.
And maybe say people, and Charlie loved Nelson because, you roll over and laugh at those sort of things at the time. And he won 3 world championships, 2 of them for Brabham. Maybe he lucked in the first one, did enough in the second one, and Renault failed in South Africa. And then his best championship arguably was in 87. With Williams.
Yeah, absolutely. Crikey. No, you don't have a wee in the car.
You didn't think you were going to get this, did you?
I didn't think I'd be talking about Nelson Piquet weeing in cars, but it's great. It's fascinating. It's what an insight. Hang on. Someone's posted a video of Elio playing the piano. We'll watch that later on. So yes. Let's have a quick shot. Oh, and then more politics again. Imola, you didn't race at Imola because of all the hoo-ha going on with the constructors and everything else. After South Africa, was that a bit not tiresome, because it's a different subject, but you were thinking, oh crikey, not again, because it had all gone off. There was an issue with, was it Rosberg or something, and they've been disqualified for or something. I can't remember what it was.
I don't remember. I mean, following, by the time we went to South Africa, so after South Africa, we went to, I don't know if it was Long Beach or not. I don't think Long Beach was the 3rd race. So South Africa, I think, from memory, was the first one. There was something in between the two, either Brazil or might have been, anyway. And then we came to Imola, and that was a political war between, on the one hand, Formula One and the power that they were generating vis-a-vis the president of the FIA, Jean-Marie Balès, who insisted that the power of Formula One lies at the FIA. That's for Formula. It's their world championship. It's not the team's world championship. And I mean, Bernie and Max found a very difficult adversary in Jean-Marie Balestre. He held a lot of trump cards. And if there had been, for example, any prospect of a breakaway Formula One, what you might call championship, first of all, it'd be difficult to call it the world championship as we knew it.
Yeah.
But also because circuits are all licensed through their own national governing bodies, which are all associated with the FIA.
Right.
If any circuit decided to go with a pirate Formula One thing, potentially they would lose their operating license forever.
Oh, I see.
So that was a problem that, suddenly against Balestre was playing a strong hand here, and there's no easy option. So are we going to go to racing car parks or whatever? Where would we go and race? Where would these events, the 12 or 15 events that were in the calendar, where would they be held? Okay, you could bring in some new venues, which were maybe like more street circuits or whatever. But it was a tough war, and eventually both sides sort of agreed a truce between them, and they worked out that commercial rights and then those sort of things became more a Bernie thing and a Max thing, but more Bernie particularly, and the regulation side would stay more with the FIA. And in fact, just to show you how daft the whole thing was, the reason that Formula One regulations changed at the end of '82 from the ground effect car that we were running, Balestre said, "Oh, no more. Every Formula One car must have a flat bottom." Probably the dumbest regulation that Formula One has ever introduced.
Yeah. From someone who doesn't know about Formula One.
Doesn't matter. He knew his power, and he knew the authority that went with the power, and that he just dictated that's what's going to happen. I mean, it was a joke.
He played his cards that way. Ridiculous. I mean, you mentioned that are we going to go racing in car parks, and you did at Caesar's Palace at the end of the year, which we'll come to in a sec. Obviously, another couple of things happened in '82, and again, not things I really want to dwell on. I mean, starting with like probably the ultimate bittersweet weekend for you, personally, Zolder.
Yeah.
I mean, I think because with the loss of Gilles and the accident and everything that happened and what was going on with him and Peroni at Ferrari and all the infighting, for want of a better phrase, I guess some people may forget that you won that race that weekend. But for want of a better phrase, I guess there was just a heck of a cloud over the whole weekend after losing Gilles, because
I mean, obviously Gilles' popularity amongst fans and within the paddock and certainly within areas of the media, he was one of those people that galvanized the kind of love through his spirit, his racing spirit. I'm trying to think of how to phrase this. And I mean, look, at times, as I mentioned at Silverstone, he was driving the wheels off the car. I mean, it was just beyond. It's never going to be a good story, a good outcome. The events of Zolder all relate back to the mess that was Imola, and I've laid the blame for that, not so much at the feet of Pironi or Villeneuve, but at Ferrari for mishandling it and for not doing a better job. And I think that there was an element of things going on in Ferrari at that time. And I think that, Didier was looking to strengthen his situation within Ferrari, maybe persuade Ferrari that he was the person that they should put more focus on and that he could win a world championship. Gilles had 4 years at Ferrari, had done spectacular things and had won 4 Grand Prix or something, but 4 or 5 Grand Prix, maybe 6 Grand Prix, whatever it was, hadn't won the world championship. And there was obviously an undercurrent in the company and the team. And the outcome of Imola, Gilles was a very honourable, straightforward, uncomplicated racing driver. And he felt utterly betrayed by what Didier did.
Yeah.
And I mean, I would recommend anybody who wants to know more about this. There's a movie, sort of docu-movie out called Villeneuve and Pironi, or Pironi and Villeneuve, whichever.
Yeah.
And it's a 2 hour, and it goes into it, and it illustrates to some degree some of the things that occurred at that time.
Yeah.
But what occurred at Zolder, the decision that Gilles made on a lap which was of no significance whatsoever, to find, he came around over the big climb and dip and into a quick left-hand corner. Jochen Mass was coming in on an in-lap, and he saw in his mirror somebody in this car coming really quickly. And Jochen went from left to right to let that car go with the natural line up the inside. But
yeah, so he was getting off.
He was trying to get off the miss, but there was a misjudgment, and the misjudgment was part of both the drivers, really. But I always felt that because it was a time or a part of that session that was of no consequence, that Gilles should have backed off.
Yeah.
Given Jochen a bollocking afterwards for getting in his way or not doing more, but to take the long way around at that part of the racetrack where Jochen was coming further and further to the right, it was a closing gap. But that was Gilles. That was Gilles. He did things. He got away with everything until that sad day at Zolder.
And it kind of, not the luck, but it kind of ran out.
No, that's not luck. I don't call that bad luck. I call that error of judgment.
Yeah. Yeah. Better phrasing. And obviously it's very,
but nonetheless tragic. I mean, I was on the track and I came around and stopped at the scene of the accident, and I saw the remains of a Ferrari, and I saw a driver in the catch fencing. Got out of the car, walked over to it, and the driver's helmet was off, and I realized it was Gilles. So didn't take a lot to determine that his situation was very bad. So got into my car, got bump started, went back to the pits, got out of the car, and I said what had happened I'd seen, and I gave them what I believed to be the circumstance. And I just walked off and went into the hospitality and sat down and had my quiet moment myself.
Yeah, which I guess it's the best thing you can do. And we all know that he unfortunately passed away that evening.
Yes.
Yes. Very sad, and again a big shadow over the weekend. But you said about not dwelling on things, and this was very immediate. The following day, race day, and I guess there wasn't the time to dwell on what had happened. Obviously, it was very sad, and there was as I said before, there's a huge cloud over it. But is when that kind of thing happens, in the same with like Riccardo Paletti a bit later on in the year, and Didier's accident at Hockenheim, when these serious things happen, is the best thing in your mind, best thing to do is get back in the car and race, or does it depend on circumstance?
I'll give you a long-winded explanation. 73 Watkins Glen, in practice, I think it was practice, suddenly there'd been an enormous accident. I was in the pits at the time, and it was Francois Sabert had gone off in the S. There's a very quick part of the racetrack, and it was a terrible accident by all accounts.
Yeah.
By those that went to the scene of it, it was bad. It was. I don't even know what it was, but I know it was just terrible. Yeah. So anyway, eventually the circuit's reopened, and I'm standing there, and I'm driving in the third Brabham entry, and I'm thinking, well, Francois died, and surely out of respect, maybe we should just leave it there and let the session go. And Bernie came up and said, "What are you doing?" I said, well, I thought maybe out of respect we should. Say, John, you get into that car now. You're here to do a job. You're a racing driver. What happened to Francois is sad, tragic, whatever, but never forget, up until that millisecond when the accident occurred, Francois was living a life as you would have done driving any racing car, absolutely stoked. And then bang, it's gone, it's history, it's finished. As quick as that. And it was as quick as that. So get into your car, get out and do your job. And I used that little lesson Bernie taught me. I used that for the rest of my motor racing career. It gave me protection because it is wrong to dwell on certain tragedies. And that was a horrible accident. It had a big effect all through the pit lane because, again, Francois was a very popular and liked competitor. It was going to be Jackie's last Grand Prix. It was going to be his 100th Grand Prix. And he was then going to announce his retirement. For Tyrrell, Tyrrell lost the heir apparent because Francois was going to be the team leader. It just cast a horrible, you're talking about Gilles, the spell it cast over the event. It cast a similar spell over Watkins Glen. But there was a race on Sunday, and everybody raced the wheels off their car. And I think Ronnie won that race, if I'm not mistaken. And James Hunt might have been third in the march. And so come Zolder, Sunday morning, helmet back on again, visor down, off we go. There's no room. There's no room in here for any negative or whatever kind of emotions. You're there to do the job, and you're there to do it. You're a professional race driver. Don't forget it. If you can't hack it, get out.
Which is, to those of us who aren't obviously on the business side of it or the racing side of it, that is unfathomable to people like that. But obviously, as you say, that's the environment you're in, and that's the situation. And you, I guess, given that situation, it's you just have to get back in and get on with it. Wow, amazing. Very difficult. But you obviously won the race, so there was some good that came out of that.
Somebody had to win the thing.
Yeah. And
I won it. I did a good job. It took me a long time. I passed Nicky in front of the pits. Yeah. I enjoyed that little moment. And then I got stuck behind Ricardo Patrese in the Turbo Brabham. And I had to work I worked my butt off to get past Ricardo. And finally, I did it. And then I set off after Keke. And Keke was leading the race in the Williams, but he'd worn his rear tires down to the canvas. And I called him with a lap to go. Got past. Keke was always clean and fair in the racetrack. Didn't attempt to do any blocking or funny things. Took the lead, won the race. Happy days.
Yeah, nice little silver lining, to a weekend.
Well, somebody had to win the race, and I was the one.
Yeah.
I don't feel any. What do you call it? As a consequence, what's the word? I won the race, and the history books show the winner was John Watson. It doesn't say John Watson died. John Watson won the race on the weekend that Gilles Villeneuve died. It just says the winner. So it was a sad weekend for everybody, and particularly for Joanne Villeneuve, for Jacques, and for, I think I forget his sister. They lost a dad, they lost a husband, and the world lost one of those particularly charismatic racing drivers that come along from time to time. Yeah,
which is very sad, but they, obviously he's lost it, and he's, and no one's ever forgotten him, which is obviously the way it should be. But yeah, you've won the race. You were saying that, again, just to fast forward to the following. Sorry, was it later on that year, I believe? First of, you said you got to go in and you got to drive the wheels off the car. That's your job. You did it twice on 2 street circuits over in the States. I think one was shortly after. And one was the following year, Detroit and Long Beach. I've always wanted to speak to you about these because you won them from places on the grid where you shouldn't have won from, really. If you look at it objectively, from 17th in Detroit, and was it 22nd in Long Beach? We touched on it off camera.
You said there was a reload here.
Go
ahead, go on, ask.
You touched on it with off camera with the issues that you had in qualifying. You couldn't get heat into the tire, and that's why the qualifying was so much worse, I guess. I don't want to say worse than the race pace, but it was an amazing thing in those 2 races because the qualifying didn't go very well, but the race, you made it happen on both occasions.
In Detroit, for example, brand new street track, nobody had been before. Obviously, the circuit was the circuit needed to be cleaned up. All those factors. The McLaren happened to be on the Michelin tire of that period, in qualifying in particular, very light in the tire. We weren't able to put what I would call core energy into the tire to get the whole tire warm rather than just surface temperature. come the race with a full load of fuel. Remember, we're running whatever number of liters it was or kilograms of fuel on one set of tires. We weren't running pit stop tire, pit stops, all that stuff. In Detroit, the race started, and after a number of laps, it was red flagged because Patrese had gone off in turn one. So they had to recover the car, reset the tire bales and all that. In that period, one of the smartest men I've ever met, let alone in motor racing, Pierre Dupasquet, who was the Michelin competition manager. I was sitting in the car and he came and said, John, take off the 06s, put the 05s on. Why? You'll win the race. If you do what I say, you'll win the race. So I speak the guys, I said, where's Teddy? And I couldn't find anybody. So I said, guys, Pierre said, take the 06s, put the 05s on. And these are the two Michelin compounds that were the two normal compounds. And there wasn't a big difference in them. It was more about how the construction affects the compound. So put the 05s on, and the race restarts. And suddenly I'm finding myself, I've got good tire temperature, got good car balance. I was good at overtaking. And part of the reason I was good at overtaking was I employed a particular technique, which I think gave me an advantage in the braking zones and then overtaking. And instead of when I come into a braking zone, hitting the brake pedal and then going sixth, fifth, fourth, third, or whatever it was, I would just focus on the braking, hit the brake pedal hard, and then just gradually release it. And I got to the speed that I felt was the appropriate speed to go from sixth gear to third gear or whatever it was. I'd just go straight to the gear. And it meant that my whole focus on braking was not compromised by rolling my foot to blip the throttle. So I think that gave me a marginal advantage. Not in every case, but certainly in a lot of cases. On one lap, I overtook three cars. Hold on a second. This was a street track where, according to all the megas of the day, I'm talking about the drivers, not the journalists, the megas of the day, it can't pass. It's impossible to pass.
Yeah.
Well, obviously, I knew something they didn't, or nobody told me you couldn't pass. So I caught and passed Nicky into turn one. Sweet overtake. Further on the lap, caught and overtook Cheever, and it was what I'd call a committed move. Yeah. And Cheever was about to close the door, then he pulled away. 2 corners later, I got myself into a position to pass Pironi in the Ferrari. So I got alongside and did a late dive. And so 3 cars in 1 lap. Nicky had been sitting behind those 2 cars for God knows how many laps. You can't pass. You can't pass. Once I overtook them, put in another chip into the brain, take the no pass chip out, put the you can pass chip in. Then he got past them. And then eventually I caught and passed Keke, who was leading the race. But of course, what I hadn't realized, I thought I'd taken the lead. But because they were taking into account the time differences between where we were at race part 1 and so I had to extend my advantage over Keke to finish whatever 20 seconds or whatever was ahead of him to the winner. And eventually I did. When Nicky got past Cheever and Pironi, and then he came up behind Keke. But instead of being decisive, committed, he came up and Keke was on the outside, sort of did one of these things, and Keke had to take his. So Keke clipped his nose and knocked Nicky's nose off. And Ron was pissed.
I bet.
Because
having seen you make the moves,
if you'd done through the count back and Nicky gotten through cleanly, arguably would have been 1-2, whether he'd have been first or I would have been first. But that was a McLaren 1-2 for the taking. And Ron was so pissed about it.
I bet. It's all quite strange. I mean, I've heard a few people say that Nicky was, he's very sort of thoughtful and was calculating everything, and his big thing was risk, wasn't it? How much risk are you going to take in each situation, everything like that. Whereas it feels like in that situation, you just said right, stuff the risk, get up the inside and go, maybe if you can do it.
Nicky sat behind 2 cars for God knows how many laps. Didn't make an attempt, as far as I was aware, to pass them. I come along, bosh. You can pass. what he didn't do, passing Keke, is show conviction and commitment
to make it happen.
And Keke, Keke had to turn at some point, but Nicky was waiting for him to pull over and let him, come through, Nicky, come through. Well, it doesn't quite work like that.
Not going to happen. Yeah.
But I'd never any problem overtaking on the occasions that I did pass Keke, because he also respected my ability and my commitment under overtaking or braking situations.
Yeah.
And anyway, it can't change history. I mean, one of the things that Nicky, he never did anything in a race car prior to having had a chance to test it or whatever. And in that context with passing Keke, he didn't show us a commitment in doing it or conviction. And he paid the price.
Yeah, you could have had another
but
race
look,
win.
Nicky's the three-time world champion. Who am I to talk?
yeah. Well, but it's just on that, especially at Long Beach. I mean, it was just that, that decisiveness that got you the win, and I mean, it must have been, fantastic feeling having started 22nd to have come through and on it. I think it's still a record, isn't it? No one's won from that far back.
Well, they're never going to win if we've only got 20 cars in the field anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
But, I mean, Nicky and I both started at the back of the field because, again, the same issue, street track, and we just couldn't get tire temperature. But when the race started with the fuel load on board, we got the energy into the tire, and the tire then came, and the car was a great little car, honestly. And we went forward in tandem, and every time he passed somebody, I was literally on his gearbox. So I was this doppelganger for over half the race. I felt that I could, at a particular point, I was going to make a move, and it came at the end of Lake Shore Drive, I think they call it, or Shores, whatever. It was the sort of curving straight. And I made it was a late break, and I got alongside, and the car sort of swerved a bit to the left because the left front brake had momentarily grabbed. And after the race, he said, "Why'd you do that?" "Oh, well," I said, "Look, I didn't do it on purpose. I don't do those things. Just I was late in the brakes, but I made the corner. I got into the corner, and once I was past, it was gone."
Yeah, brilliant, fantastic. And it's obviously gone. It's gone down in history as one of those great wins.
It was let's say it was a win that came unexpectedly. There was stunned silence in the McLaren management. Let's put it that way. When we both came back into the pits, and where did that come from? Or whatever. Give us the tools, we'll do the job. And in the race, both of us did a very good job in that race.
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic. Love it. I love it. Let's sort of fast forward into the end of the year. You touched on it earlier with, things going your way with Brabham and not with McLaren. When it sort of transpired that, that Alan was going to come back to the team and everything, and you weren't to be retained, I mean, were you thinking, did you look elsewhere in F1, or were you thinking, yes?
Okay, the scenario with Alan rejoining McLaren was very simple. The last Grand Prix of '83 was in Kyalami. Alan ought to have been the world champion, but mechanical failure, I think it was, in the race. He retired, and then Piquet did enough to win the championship. Everybody flew back home on Saturday night. On Sunday, Alain was requested to attend the Régie, the Renault headquarters in Paris, whereupon he was fired on the spot. Bloody hell, that's a bit strong.
Wow.
Never, no one really ever found out or knows what the truth is, but there's obviously stories. And so immediately Alan gets on the phone to Philip Morris, to John Hogan, who was the character, the personality, and said, "I've been fired. Is there an opportunity at Ferrari?" And John said, "No, the Ferrari seats are fully committed, but we've got a seat at McLaren. Nicky's under contract. John's out of contract for '84. We'd like to talk to you about joining us '84 and whatever." And on Monday, I got a call from Nicky to say, "Be careful. Alain is looking to take your seat." But the reality was that Nicky and I were both what we called senior drivers by that stage, both in terms of experience, but more importantly, age. I was, I think, 37 or something, and Nicky was 35. The concern that McLaren had was that I could turn around and say I'm going to retire, or Nicky could turn around and say he's going to retire, or we could both say that, and McLaren would be left in a situation without a top line driver or top line drivers. So they looked. I mean, look, it's a gift horse. You don't look twice. A driver of Alain's ability at that time, and there was a particular commercial context which was advantageous to McLaren to re-engage him. It was a no-brainer. Yeah. I honestly, and I say that, and I've said this to people at McLaren till I'm blue in the face. I've got no resentments whatsoever about Alain being brought back into the team and taking my seat. I was disappointed that the situation arose and I didn't have the chance to drive in 1984 in what was, a fantastic year for McLaren. One of the two drivers was going to win the world championship. As it turned out, Nicky won it by half a point from Alain.
Yeah,
I could have been in Alain's position, or I could have won that championship, arguably. But yeah, that's life. That was a completely unforeseen circumstance, and McLaren and Marlboro made a commercial judgment for the best interests of their team, looking down the road. And that's all there was to it. There's nothing personal. It was just a commercial judgment. And I mean, look, if I'd been in the management of the team, I would have done the same thing because that was the right thing for the team.
Yeah, which was obviously with all the backing and the sponsorship and the team and everything.
Well, you have to think down the road because
that's got to be first.
Just what I've said about Nicky and I being senior drivers. Alain at that point was middle 20s, so he was going to be a driver who would be around for certainly 6, 8, 10 years even, and could be at McLaren for any or all of those years. So he was coming into that purple patch in his career, and he was representing what the future generation was going to be.
Yeah, and obviously, as it turned out, he stayed for 6, 7 seasons.
Well, he stayed 84 through until 89, I think it was.
9, yeah. And then went off. So yeah, it was obviously the call that they made. So obviously after F1 and that sort of closed, you did a few runnings of that endurance race in France that we mentioned earlier. Yeah. And there's just a couple of cars that I've always wanted to speak to you about because there's certainly two cars here that are my favourites in the world of sports cars. The Porsche 962C, especially the 85 car, and the Jaguar, the XJR9 from 88. Two of my favourite sports cars ever. You've driven them both.
Yes, I have.
Very jealous. 85 you retired quite late on in the race. Was it the 20th hour or 21st hour?
In Le Mans.
Yeah.
No, I think I retired in the morning, but so maybe about 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning.
In the morning, a bit earlier.
Yeah.
But
I mean, first of all, the two cars, the Le Mans Porsche configuration, I've said that in my view, that is the best Le Mans car I'd ever driven.
Really?
I drove the 956 short tail in a couple of races in 84, shared with Stefan Beloff in Fuji for the 1,000 kilometers at the end of 84. And we won that race, or I should say, Stefan won the race and I co-drove with him. Stefan Beloff and a Porsche at that time was unbelievable. Stefan, just in a 956, there was no quicker driver in a 956 than Stefan Beloff. But then we won that race. And then 85, I think it was a 962. The aerodynamics of the Porsche long tail setup made a really, really great car. When Jaguar came in 87, we wiped the floor in all the sprint of every race apart from Le Mans. And the Le Mans Jaguar package, they took too much of the downforce the car had, took it away. And because of the configuration with the V12 engine, which was long, tall, and heavy, it upset basically the center of gravity of the car. So the car became a lot less comfortable and a lot more tricky to drive than it was in the short tail configuration. But in 88, they put back some of the downforce into the car, not the sprint car configuration, and that was then a much better car. And that was the car that ultimately brought success back to Jaguar by winning in 1988. And it was a titanic battle between the Shell Porsche and who was it? Dumfries, Andy
Wallace.
Andy Wallace. Who was the
Was it Jan?
Was it
Jan?
was Jan Lammers? Yes.
Yeah, it was Jan Lammers.
So that 88 car was a very good car. But in terms of what was the most comfortable car, I would have said the Porsche was the more comfortable of the two. In sprint configuration, the Jaguar in 87 just blew the Porsche out of the water. Just had so much more downforce, and was such a much more modern car. Had a full carbon fiber chassis. Had huge, aero tunnels under the car. The V12 engine, while it was tall, heavy, but it was quite narrow, so we got big, aero tunnels. Whereas a flat six motor, which Porsche had, restricted the depth of the aero tunnels, and it was a bigger compromise. Still a great race car, but the Jaguar in the sprint configuration was definitely the better of the two cars.
Oh, fantastic. Love those. I just love hearing about all the ins and the outs of the engines and all that kind of stuff in these cars, because they were just, I mean, to me, even it was the era that I got into sports cars, and it's just absolutely fantastic.
Well, that was that period, particularly the back end of the 80s, when Sauber started to get it sorted out. Nissan, Toyota, Jaguar, Porsche. I mean, 5 major brands, plus all the customer Porsches. And some of those customer Porsches, they were going down their own route as well, because they realized that the bog standard kit of parts that Porsche produced in terms of torsional rigidity, aerodynamics. I mean, people like Richard Lloyd and others went off in their own direction to try and maintain a position, a competitive platform with what was going on at the front of the field. And certainly, eventually, Sauber became the preeminent group of cars in terms of the balance of horsepower over downforce versus, and that Sauber of 1988, 89, and into 90, really impressive.
It was. I mean, I actually spoke with Kenny Atchison a few weeks ago, who obviously drove that car, and he said it's the best car he's ever driven. He said it's just a fabulous car.
He actually owns one.
Sorry?
He actually owns one.
Yes, I had him on, and he had it in the background. He had his F3, F2.
Yeah, and Formula 4, yeah.
And his car, yeah, he's actually invited me down there whenever I'm in the area to go and have a look at it. So I'm going to take him up on that.
No, you should do. I mean, Kenneth's a good guy, a really nice guy.
Yeah, he's a great guy. And he loves his football as well, so that's good. Just to sort of step on to the post-racing side, a few people have been asking about your commentary. You've done many commentary things. Obviously, we know you're with David Addison on the GTs and everything. A lot of people have asked about your time commentating on the BTCC alongside Charlie Cox. Excuse me. Was that something that you enjoyed, the touring cars?
I mean, it came about at a point when certainly Eurosport had been taken off the air at the end of 96, I think it was, end of 96. So I was doing odds and sods, and an opportunity arose with BTCC. It was a domestic series. I'd never had any great information, knowledge, or whatever of touring cars. But again, at the point, there was the hiatus of touring car racing in Great Britain, with about 10 different manufacturers involved. And there was unbelievable racing. I mean, just door handle to door handle, literally racing. And I think that, I mean, I know I see occasionally the touring car races. David Addison, my co-commentator, he's the lead commentator for British touring cars. But maybe it's me looking in rose-tinted glasses back to that period of late 80s, early 90s, or was it late 90s, early 20s, whatever it was. I just felt that was a wonderful time when you'd say 10 different manufacturers, again, front wheel drive, rear wheel drive, whatever, and there were some great drivers. I mean, names that are still household names to this day.
Sorry, on the outside. Yeah, and I've always said between like 88 and 98, that was the BTCC era for me. It was just that kind of 10-year time. There was some fantastic cars and drivers, and manufacturers. I did see earlier on in the chat, there was like Jerry Marney said he'd like to say hello.
Hi, Jerry.
So
haven't seen you for a few years. Used to be around a lot.
Say hi. Yeah, I've got to say hi to you from Jerry. So yeah, he's a great guy. We like Jerry. So no, fantastic beat. I mean, just keeping it on time and stuff. I mean, there's so much we could talk about, but I mean, I guess there's so many things we can talk about. But we've covered most of the things. I think we always try and finish up with just some fun questions, some fairly quick fire ones, if you're happy to do that before we wrap up. Very quickly, did you have a favorite driver when you were growing up?
There's only one favorite driver. Fangio.
I was going to ask. That was one of my guesses.
Because I saw him as a child. I saw him race once in Andrade in the 1955 Tourist Trophy race. But I was aware as a child, because I would get whatever the magazines of the day where my father, because he was racing locally as well. And there was something about Fangio, but particularly because he won those 5 world championships, but he won them on 4 different manufacturers' products.
Yeah.
And there's no other driver in the history has done that. And for me,
I don't think
it was such it went in so deeply that there have been other fantastic world champions subsequently. But to me, in that time, in the cars they were racing, on the racetracks they raced on, Fangio was the benchmark. And I think I know that Jackie Ickx has said the same thing, and I'm sure many drivers, more maybe of my generation, it was really sad. I wonder how many Formula One drivers of today would know who Fangio was.
Yeah.
I mean, the history. Do they teach history to kids today? Do they know anything about our sport?
Yeah,
Jesus wept.
Certainly hope so. I mean, we try and put, on the social media, try and keep it all, keep history ticking over. But people like Fangio, he should always be remembered.
Well, I mean, because he was a part of my period of growing up, and principally reading about him, but seeing that one time in Andrade, and just the manner in which he conducted himself on the racetrack and his ability. I mean, he was in his middle 40s. He wasn't a sort of a prepubescent Formula One driver, as some of them appear to be today. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, just amazing, especially in the era that you did it in. This is always a good one. The best and worst car you raced.
I mean, the best car I raced. I mean, I'm very fortunate. I've had lots of extremely good cars, but I refer back, I think, to the Hexagon Brabham BT44, because that was the first actual truly competitive Formula One car I had raced. And it's about like the first time you do anything in your life, you never forget it. Yeah. And I'll leave that to your imagination.
Yeah. So many different ways you can look at that, isn't there?
I'll leave it to you, Richard. Up to you.
Yeah. Over to you guys. No, excellent. Did you have a favourite circuit to race at when you were racing?
I don't think I mean, I think there were circuits that I loved. I mean, I mentioned Watkins Glen. I thought that in that period for the cars of that time, I thought that's about as good a racetrack in the world. Just sensational. Just worked for me. Worked for the cars. I mean, Brands Hatch likewise I was at Brands Hatch recently for one of the SRO Fanatec GT World or GT Challenge Europe events. Yeah. But in a GT car now, the cars are so physically large, even compared to a Formula One car of my generation. It's diminished the size of the circuit, and its overtaking is quite difficult. Silverstone was a different place. Silverstone was always, in my time, a high-speed circuit, totally different to Brands. Just simply that it was the speed, the lap speed. I love Monza. I love going to Monza. I love Italy anyway. I'm a foodie. The tifosi, the emotion, the passion. Now, there's not lots of things about Italy are maybe not so good, but you go to Monza, and the first time I went to Monza was 1971, and our cars were in what was the old paddock, the old garages that were used for races, in probably pre-war and then in the post-war. And the history that was in those garages, because Maserati, Ferrari, Mercedes, whatever manufacturers of the period, their cars were in those garages. And It's just, you look at the tribunes on the other side from the pits. The commentary booths are at the very top of the tribunes. Those tribunes had politicians. I mean, don't want to talk about the war and all that, but it's just, the Monza Park is a beautiful park, and I just love Monza. The atmosphere, it's an emotional, atmospheric thing. Buenos Aires, the Autodromo in Buenos Aires, what a magic racetrack. The original circuit, Interlagos, the original layout of
Yes, a long
Interlagos,
one.
the original Österreichring.
Yeah.
I mean, I wish that some of the kids today could take a Formula One car, if these places were able to cope with it, and go out and actually understand, wow, did people race in this?
Yeah. Yeah. Their jaw would hit the
Yeah.
floor with some of them. Fantastic circuits. All
And
absolutely.
of course, don't forget Montjuic Park. That for me was, that's the definitive, I would say, street circuit of all the street circuits I've raced on.
Yeah, fantastic. We'll try and bring it back in some form. Maybe have a classic historic race or something there, if it was possible. It'd be fantastic to see. Okay, last two. Is there anything you'd have liked to have had a go at? I mean, obviously, if the opportunity had come up, whether it be IndyCar or NASCAR or even the touring cars side of things, because you had a couple of races in it. But
I mean, I was very happy with the career. I had 10 seasons of Formula One, and then when that situation arose at the end of '83, I mean, I looked at an opportunity. One was presented to me by Lotus, but what I had realized was they didn't want me specifically, and this was more about a personality, Peter War, and another personality, Nigel Mansell. Peter War was not a natural ally of Nigel, and Peter was in a position to, if he could find another British driver, they had to have a British driver for sponsorship reasons. So they approached me to join the team and drive with Elio in '84. I'd come out of a 5-year term at McLaren, but what I realized was they didn't actually want me. They just didn't want Nigel. And I thought, well, hold on. I want something. I want a little bit more of an embrace, but
yeah.
And there were other issues as well, which I won't get involved with. But that was the principal one. That they didn't actually want me. They just, at that point, Peter Ward didn't like Nigel, and that was, get rid of him. If he could, he would have done. I mean, Nigel's not fully aware of all this, I suspect. But I mean, it's because of that he retained his drive, and he consequently got on and did a fantastic job at Williams, and ultimately won his world championship.
Yeah, fair enough to him. Okay, this is the final question, and it's probably absolutely impossible. I mean, you've raced against and with so many, amazing drivers from down the years. I mean, I've got a big list here. I'm not going to read them all, but I mean, it's from guys, like Jody Scheckter, Clay Regazzoni, Jock and Mass. You raced against Graham Hill early on, Denny Holm, Carlos Reutemann, Mark Donoghue, Hans Stuck, Hunt, Peroni, Bell, Wallach, Halewood, and Haywood. PK Mansell, Alboreto, Prost, X, Fittipaldi, Villeneuve, Lauda, Andretti. I mean, this list goes on and on and on from the various eras. Is there one that sticks out in your mind as being, I don't know, maybe not the best, or who sort of sticks out in your mind as being one that you would, I don't know, least like to go racing against because of their competitiveness? Or is there anyone that is?
I mean, look, I would happily take on every and all of the ones that you've mentioned.
I'm sure.
I've been asked a question: who do I consider to be Britain's greatest Formula One driver? And my response is Jackie Stewart, or Sir Jackie Stewart. And I say that because I think Jackie at that time was an extremely capable race driver. That's the if you like, the mechanical side of being a race driver. But what he also was probably in his period the smartest. And I think that the drivers that I have maybe most respect for are not necessarily the ones that want to plonk it and pole position ad infinitum, but the ones that understand how to win a race and how to win a championship. And Jackie, in that period in sort of late 60s into the early 70s, The phone's going. Just 1 second.
That's okay, no problem. We're wrapping up very shortly, guys. Very shortly. It's been 3 hours 45 minutes, and it's been absolutely fantastic. I'm sure you'll agree. What an honour to talk to John. Oh, he's just coming back.
Sorry about that, folks.
That's all right.
So to me,
Saved by the bell.
what Jackie achieved was not so much what he achieved, but the manner in which he went about his job. And you don't have to be in pole position to win a race, but you have to finish if you want to win a world championship. And it was that, if you like, understanding of his job as a professional racing driver. But then subsequently, it's the manner in which he has conducted his professional life outside of the car. And he is, without hesitation, the most successful race driver, Grand Prix driver, post-professional racing career. And he, for me, is the what do you want to call it? The man who has set the example to everybody else. If they want to follow, not everybody will want to follow, not everybody will have that kind of, ambition or drive or whatever. But Jackie is the one that I think has done it. And I defer to him when I get asked that question. And I mean, he was a pretty formidable competitor. You don't win 3 world championships, especially when more or less most of your competitors had a similar power plant. I know that occasionally the Matra was quick, and I know other occasions Ferrari was very quick. Jackie won the 3 world championships.
Yeah, and you got the better of them. He sort of set the benchmark, I guess.
Yeah,
which is fantastic, wonderful. I think that's where we're going to wrap up. I mean, it's been almost 4 hours. It's flown by. It's been absolutely brilliant speaking with you, John. It's been, thank you for coming on, sparing your time, giving us your insights and your knowledge of an amazing career. Thank you so much.
Listen, I hope I haven't worn you out, because I'm accustomed to doing endurance events. And it's been easy. It's been fun. I mean, the time's flown by. Hopefully, I've given you some insights into certain areas which probably are not widely known. And I'm sure there'll be a few people who will thoroughly disagree with some of my views and will maybe accordingly, express their opinions. Anyway, I've enjoyed it, and thank you very much.
No, thank you very much, and thank you to everyone who's tuned in for the comments and the questions and everything. If we do disagree, then we disagree. That's what makes the world such a fun place. But no, thank you everyone for tuning in. Again, thank you very much again to you, John. It's been an absolute privilege speaking with you. So thank you very, very, very much, and I hope we can catch up again soon.
Yeah, but this is only part 1 of 6 series, so don't worry. I'll be back. As Arnie said, I'll be back.
I certainly hope so. No, thank you very much, everyone. And we'll see you for the next one. Thanks a lot, guys.